I would like to pick up right where we left off, and we haven't actually got to the Passion Week Sunday morning, but I said that there are two events which really set the scene, and I think we need to establish as a backdrop. And the first event is that remarkable prophecy which Jesus made to some angry, murderous Pharisees who had come over into Perea, where Jesus had fled, after in John 10 at the Feast of Dedication, they had picked up stones to stone him. And so, wise as a serpent, he simply made his way about 15 miles into the jurisdiction of Herod Antipas, and now they have come to try and lure him back. And we talked about this last night, and Jesus basically tells them he's not going to fall for their little prank, their little plot, but then he makes this stunning prophecy that you'll not see me until you say, "Blessed is he who comes in the name of the Lord," which is to say, you'll not see me until you sing the psalm which God gave you to teach you how to receive your Messiah. Does that make sense? Now, the second event is the raising of Lazarus. And I would, this is so exciting. I'd love to spend time here, but I'm going to be quick. Again, Jesus is in Perea. I have it on the map there. Lazarus is from Bethany. Bethany is a village on the eastern slope of the Mount of Olives. And I talked about this last night. If you're going to go east to Perea from Jerusalem, you're going to have to go down across the Kidron Valley and up the Mount of Olives and then down the eastern slope, the backside. And just as you crest the eastern slope, just as you crest the mountain, the Mount of Olives, it runs north-south, of course, and just as you cross over it, there's Bethany. So it's not in Jerusalem, but it is very, very close, very much a suburb. And so the family of Lazarus dispatch a servant to go to Jesus and say, "The one whom you love is sick." Now listen, I love this story. It's John chapter 11. Matter of fact, why don't I do this? I'll go to John 11, and I'm just gonna highlight a couple of. Oh man, it's so much fun to talk about. But let me just say this: that this is within, I would argue, 2 or 3 weeks before the Passover at which Jesus will die. It's very, very close, and the reason I say that is because after Jesus raises Lazarus from the dead, the official body of leadership, the Sanhedrin, you've heard of these in the New Testament, it's often called the council. Rome was, in fact, the 500-pound gorilla. Rome absolutely controlled the Mediterranean world and beyond. But Rome did not want to try to oversee your local issues and especially your local religion. So there was always some body, some local governing body, which Rome authorized or acknowledged as giving as giving local leadership. And so all things Jewish, all things religious in Israel and especially in Jerusalem were overseen by this council of 70 aristocratic men, and the council was called the Sanhedrin. And the Sanhedrin is going to put a price on Jesus' head. That's where I'm taking you after this. And I don't think, all right, I'm getting way ahead of myself. I'll explain it as I go. So let me just say that I meant to tell you going in, we got a lot of ground to cover this morning. And I really want to, my attempt is going to be to help you catch the flow of the week. But we're not going to be able to go in detail through all the various elements of the week, so I'm going to pick some highlights. And Lazarus is one of them, but we'll be quick here. But the story is this, that, of course, Jesus hears that the one whom he loves is sick. And so, interestingly enough, he waits for 2 days. You have this, so much to talk about here. But it says... So they came and said, "The one whom you love is sick." And look at here in verse 5, he stayed 2 more days in the place where he was. Now that's curious. Why? And it says he loved them so much that he stayed 2 days. All right, what's going on? I think I can tell you. But what happens is that Jesus does then make his way to Bethany. Martha encounters him. Why didn't you come? She's upset and so on. He's going to live again. And then Jesus says, and by the way, I haven't got time for by the ways, Bookman, but this is a fascinating illustration of this dynamic, this God-man, because on the one hand, he has come to raise him from the dead. He says, I am the resurrection. But after he says this to Martha, the next thing he says is, where have they laid him? See, this is genuine. Jesus lived his life like you, and had the Spirit of God directed him to access his omniscience or whatever. Then he went out, but he didn't, and so he asked an honest question. But at any rate, they take him to the tomb. Now, here's the thing. I mentioned yesterday that it's so helpful to get to know Jewish burials and weddings as well. When a man died, what happened was when a man died, number one, they almost always, there's some debate about this, but it's certainly true here, they buried in family tombs, and it's a cave, and it's a man-made cave. You would hollow out a cave out of a limestone hillside, and you would carve it out. And many times you're going to build a wall or a building, so you're taking out building blocks, but as you do, you leave a usable space. And it might be a cave where you would keep animals, into which perhaps the Messiah would be born. But in this case, it's a cave carved out as a tomb. And what you would do, and I can take you to these, there are really nice examples of them, but what they would do is leave a number of stone tables. Just carve it out so there's stone tables. And when the man died, his body, number one, would be washed and wrapped, and then, I should say they would. All right, the Jews made no attempt. They don't to this day, Orthodox Jews, make any attempt to retard the decay. Okay, but you have 3 days. There's nothing more important than to honor the person who has died, and the way you do that is to participate in his burial. And so you've got 3 days. The news is going to go out, and people are going to come as quickly as they can. And for 3 days, that body lays on that stone table, and they take cloth and probably what he was wearing and just rip it into long strips, and then they wrap and they soak it in perfumed water, and then they wrap the body. Now, all they're trying to do with the perfumed water is keep the smell down, because you're in this little tomb, this little cave tomb, and you want to have enough time for as many people as can get there and participate. It's so important. Does that make sense to you? Now, when you get done, it almost looks like a mummy, but it's not a mummy because they've done nothing to retard the decay, as I say. So that body is going to lay there for 3 days. At the end of 3 days, and let me just say, the first day is when he dies. Not when in the day, but the first day is when he dies. Second day, third day. At the end of the third day, you take that little stone, it's usually the stones about this high, and because you need to be able to move them rather easily. So you roll that stone over the mouth of the cave, and you chink it. And it's not because they don't want animals. They know that the body's going to be eaten of worms and so on. Most cave tombs are in a living space. Remember, it says in John that where Jesus was crucified, nearby there was a garden. Whenever you encounter a garden in the Bible, it's a farm, okay? It's some sort of agricultural installation. So in this case, it's a wine producing, where I'm talking about Jesus' death now. I can't even keep up with my own self. Are you keeping up with me? The point is that it says that in the garden there was a tomb. Remember that? Nearby there was a farm, and in the farm there was a tomb. All right, we'll come back to that. So the point is that body is going to continue to rot for several months, and the stench is going to be awful. And so Lazarus dies. And the Bible is explicit. Martha says, because Jesus comes and says, roll away the tomb, and Martha is horrified because this is a horrible faux pas, social faux pas. That subject, people have come to commiserate, and Jesus, when Jesus, Mary hears that Jesus is there, she comes out, Martha and Mary and Jesus go to the tomb, which is somewhere on the property, and now all the visitors, all the mourners come and so on, and when that tomb is opened, it's going to be a horrible stench. As that stench is going to roll out of there, it's going to get in your eyes and your mustache and who knows what, and so, honest to goodness, and so Martha is, I always think Martha is kind of, can you still get away with this? I don't know what happened to this woman, but she's kind of the Martha Stewart of her own day, you know what I'm saying? She's in the Bible, she's the happy homemaker, for heaven's sakes, and she's very, very sensitive to and so Martha's, no, you can't. But they do, and I imagine people are backing up and, covering their noses and so on. But now just get in the moment. Here stands Lazarus. Jesus says, Lazarus, come out of there. Now, you must have thought the man is crazy. Now, to be sure, he's got a history of a lot of miracles and so on, but nonetheless, this is pretty dramatic. And here's Lazarus. He's all wrapped up. I don't even know how he got off that shelf without hurting himself, but I picture him, he comes hopping out, and remember Jesus says, cut him loose. I think the point is that they wrapped a head. I think Jesus was concerned maybe that he'd suffocate. He'd have to do this all over again, you know what I'm saying? But they do, and now, the point is, and I want to just read to you what it says about the result of this. It says in John 11 that... So he comes to the tomb. Oh, so much fun here. But here is the result of this miracle. Number one, in verse 45, many of the Jews, John uses the word Jews again and again to refer to the leadership. Not exclusively. You have to watch the context. It's clear what he is saying is some of those Sanhedrinists who had resisted Jesus, when they saw this, many of the Jews who had come to Mary had seen the things Jesus did, believed in him. But watch this. Some of them went away to the Pharisees and told them the things they did. And now watch this. The chief priests, those are the Sadducees, and the Pharisees, the chief priests and the Pharisees. Now, they hate each other's guts, but they've found something they can agree on. And that is, we got to be rid of this Jesus guy. And so when it says the chief priests and the Pharisees, that's the Sanhedrin. All right, that's the official body of leadership, and they gathered the council. That's the word that we often translate Sanhedrin when we think of it. So they got together and they said, oh boy, what shall we do, for this man works many signs? Now, I'm going to tell you something. There's a real easy, twofold, I would say, biblical answer to that question. What do you do if somebody comes working signs, legitimate signs? And let me stop on that. You see, I want to come back to this tomorrow morning. But you have to understand why did Jesus wait for 2 days? I think he knew how long he was going to take it, and it was important to show up on the fourth day. Now, we know he showed up on the fourth day. I'm saying that it was deliberate. That's why he waited 2 days. I think there are two reasons why the fourth day is significant, strategic. Number one, when a man died, there was a very well-defined cycle of mourning. It went on for a year. But the first week is where they would basically, what today they call sit shiva. Are you familiar with that? When a man dies, when a person dies, you just go and sit with the family and so on and commiserate. Well, the high day of mourning, the first week was a week of mourning, but the high day was always the fourth day, because on the third day the tomb was sealed. So Jesus knows that the crowd's going to be the largest on Wednesday. But most important, folks, get this. Jesus knows that tomb is going to be sealed for a better part of a day. And that stench is going to build up. And when that stone is rolled away, it's going to come rolling out of there. Why is that important? Listen, folks. The reality of Lazarus' resuscitation, being brought from the dead, is only as certain as the fact of his death, right? You can't counterfeit that death stench. And so Jesus very carefully contrives to make sure that nobody could question the reality of the miracle. Does that make sense to you? So I'm saying this sign is incontrovertible. And now the Sanhedrin is saying, what should we do? This man works many signs. And I'm saying, given that, God taught Israel to look for a sign, because the sign, the miracle, the genuine miracle, was the means by which he proved true a man's claim to be a divine messenger. So the answer to the question is, what should we do? Is, I say, number one, check your scriptures. Is there anything about his message that contravenes what God has already said? Because God said in Deuteronomy 13, I may send you somebody who has signs and he's teaching you false teaching, stone him. So check the script. And number two, bow the knee. You know what I'm saying? If he's doing signs, he's speaking for God. That's the answer to the question. It's not their answer, though. He says, what should we do? This man works many signs. If we let him alone like this, everyone will believe in him, and the Romans will come and take away both our place. I think that means our standing. Some people think it means the temple, but I think it means our place. We're wealthy, we're important, we're our place and our nation. And one of them, now I'm not going to read it all, but the point is, there are three results of the raising of Lazarus. John's telling of the passion narrative begins right here, because this sets the scene. Does that make sense? In three ways. Number one, it says that from that day, they plotted to put him to death. Now, there had been several attempts on his life, even as far as early as the Galilee in Matthew chapter 12. It says the Pharisees were going about how to destroy him and so on. But now the official body of Jewish leadership has determined he has to die. And notice this, verse 57. Both the chief priests and the Pharisees, there it is again, that's the Sanhedrin, had given a command, if anyone knew where he was, he should report it, that they might seize him. After Lazarus, Jesus is a fugitive. Now, all that you think about, all that we survey very, very quickly in the Passion Week, understand he has got to be so circumspect. And he's got to carry himself so carefully. And a lot of ways he does it. Now, again, what the frustration is on the part of the Sanhedrin is that Jesus is already wildly popular, and he's going to be more so in a couple of days. So they can't just grab him. They have to somehow, matter of fact, I'll jump ahead. On Tuesday night, Judas is going to sneak off to the personal home of Caiaphas, south of the city of Jerusalem, and bargain to betray Jesus. And there's a lot of confusion about that. Matter of fact, let me just take that. I'm jumping to Tuesday night here, just to confuse you. But in Luke 22 and verse 6, we're told exactly what Judas was hired to do. There is the notion, and I understand it, but it's dead wrong, that Judas was hired to identify Jesus. Like the Sanhedrinists wanted to arrest him, but he couldn't pick him out of a lineup. You know, something like, okay, no, we know better than that. There was no set of human features more familiar at this time than that of Jesus. And by the way, where that comes from is the kiss, the one whom I kiss. The kiss was for the Roman soldiers, because in order to arrest Jesus, and more importantly, because they feared there would be a riot, a whole cohort of soldiers is going to be dispatched to arrest Jesus on Thursday night, and they don't know who Jesus is. But the Sanhedrinists know very well who Jesus is. And so there in verse 6, it says, he promised and sought opportunity, here it is, he promised and sought opportunity to betray him in the absence of the multitude. That's their problem. Now set that aside. Does that make sense to you? So what I'm saying is that in John, the Sanhedrinists put a price on Jesus' head. So Jesus is a fugitive. This is really remarkably dramatic. Oops, that's not what I want to do. I want to go back to John. So first of all, there's a price on Jesus' head. Secondly, I want you to see this. Where am I? I want to be in John right there. Secondly, in the yellow. Therefore, Jesus no longer walked openly among the Jews. He went from there into the country near the wilderness. Now, the wilderness here means the frontier, the border. and it is the border between Judea and Samaria. So he goes to a little town called Ephraim. This is exactly where I'm going to pick it up in just a minute. And he tarries there until it's time to go to the Passover. Now, okay. It helps, I think, to have some background to this. But you remember in John chapter 4 that very early in Jesus' ministry, he said he's going to go up. This is when he's going up to do the Galilean ministry, but he tells his disciples, I need to go through Samaria. Remember that? It was necessary that he go through Samaria. Now understand, again, you've got Judea to the south, and Samaria to the north, and Galilee to the far north. Now, Galilee is where most of the Jews live. But the point is that to get from Galilee to Jerusalem, I have this in the PowerPoint, so shut up, Bookman. But the fact is that normally it's very dangerous for Jews to pass through Samaria. Jesus does. And I know that the common thing, and folks, be patient with me, okay? But I know the common reason is, well, remember John chapter 4, Jesus went through Samaria because he knew that there was this woman there whom he would lead to salvation. I don't think Jesus lived his life that way. And there's no indication, and I think the reason, and I'm going to say, I think Jesus' strategy was this, that he knew how helpful it would be if he had standing in Samaria. And so I think he probably set out thinking, and listen, most of the stories, I think most is safe. Certainly many of the stories that you have in the historical narrative, Old and New Testament, are meant to be representative. So this is what was, in John 2, it talks about John the Baptist pointing two disciples to Jesus and say, follow him. Well, I think that's what he did for months. That's just a representative. Does that make sense to you? So I think Jesus probably all the way along, making his way through Samaria. Every chance he had, he would stop and give the truth to people. And in this one happy instance at Sychar, by the way, come to Israel. You can go to this well. It's there. You can drink from that well, I'm telling you. But at any rate, I did several weeks ago. But at any rate, the point is that Jesus knew he encounters this woman, and she, of course, accepts his claims and then takes him into town, and they beg him to stay, and he stays for 2 days. Listen, remember I mentioned that the Jewish people in the Bible, they live as clans. And I got a friend in Jericho who is a very dear friend, a wonderful, has a huge ministry. His Muslim father, owns a restaurant there, and so we often stop and have lunch at that restaurant. And I got to talking to the aged father one time, and he told me, matter of fact, I said, he just said, I'm going to Houston. I said, oh, going to Houston. You got people in Houston? Oh, yeah, our people, we got family in Houston. I got family here, so I spend some time there. And he said, like, they started in the mid-20th century. And I said, well, how many people? And he said, I think about 1,200. Now, the fact is that that's how they live. They live as a clan. And so if Jesus has standing in Sychar, he's going to have standing in Samaria. And so we're going to come to it in just a few minutes. Jesus, at very strategic time. Remember in John 7, where it says, this is the Feast of Tabernacles. Maybe you remember this. And his brothers didn't believe on him, and they went down. And then it says Jesus tarried, and then he went down as it were in secret. Now you go to Luke 9, and you have an immediately parallel passage quite clearly, and it says he went through Samaria. So he could go through Samaria. And here he goes to a village right on the border of Samaria, and he knows, especially at feast season, the Jewish leadership is not going to come near that village. That makes sense to you? So he goes to Ephraim because he can tarry there, and I don't think for very long, but he can tarry until it's time to set out. I'm going to talk about that. So I'm going to say Lazarus, 3 results. Number 1, there's a price on his head. He's a fugitive. Number 2, for that reason, in the text, he makes his way to Ephraim. I give it to you on that map. It's just north of Jerusalem. There are 2 cities today which claim to be ancient Ephraim. One is called Ophrah, which bears the name. But at any rate, just north of Jerusalem, but on the border of Samaria. It's very important. And then the third reality is, I love this. Listen, folks, I say again, it's so much out of fashion in the academic world today. But you read John, and it's just remarkable. It's just delightful how he so carefully relates himself, synchronizes his story to the synoptics, to the Matthew, Mark, Luke, and also how he supplements them. And he knows that you've got the story of the triumphal entry in Matthew, Mark, and Luke. But he's going to give you a little insight here that'll help us answer a question I'm going to ask in just a minute. And the insight is there in the orange. John says, and remember this, John is writing late, 85, somewhere around 85 AD, which means there is no Jerusalem. There is no temple. There's no place where the Jews are living their culture except in groupings so John is giving us a remembrance of what it was like, and he says this: the Passover of the Jews was near, and many went from the country up to Jerusalem for the Passover to purify themselves. Now, what he is saying is simply that if you had incurred any sort of Levitical impurity, you had an open sore, you had a disease, you had a woman had born a baby, you touched a dead human body. If there was anything that had rendered you impure, you had to go through the rituals in order to establish, and you had to go to the priests and so on. And so the point is that because Passover was such a precious holiday or feast, people came to attend to those rites of purification before it started. Does that make sense to you? Which John is saying is the city began to swell even before the Passover itself. And so it says, so they sought Jesus and spoke among themselves. Spoke among themselves. You know what that means? They whispered. Because they knew that the Sanhedrin had put out an official, beyond the alert. And they said, as they stood in the temple, and they said, what do you think that he'll not come to the feast? Now that's huge. What John is telling us is that the whole city is abuzz with the question because of Lazarus. John 12 says that there were people who came to Passover that year who hadn't planned on it, evidently. When they heard about Lazarus, they wanted to see Lazarus. Matter of fact, that was such a dynamic, John 12 says, that the Pharisees tried to kill Lazarus. So the point is that number one, Jesus is a fugitive. Number two, he's gone to a little village called Ephraim where he knows that he'll be safe from the Sanhedrin. And number three, the whole city is abuzz, like I say, with the question, is Jesus going to come to the feast? Now, with that, let's go to, I want to ask two questions. And this is on your, I think I have these open. Did I open these? All right, I'll have to open that. But if you look on your notes, I just give a half page to this on page 5 at the bottom of the page. So that's where we are. I'm talking about these two events, the raising of the dead, Lazarus from the dead. Oh, yeah, then I give you some. So actually, if you look on page 9, I'm gonna do it up here. It's quite simple. All right, I'm going to ask two questions. Number one, we're talking about the triumphal entry, and it was going to happen on Sunday morning. Now, let's back up. We are, but I want to ask two questions. Number one, remember the prophecy Jesus made? And I said, if you'd have been there that day, you'd have said, that is not going to happen. You'll not see me till you cry out, welcome to the Messiah. How could that possibly happen? It was unthinkable. I think we can trace exactly how it happened. There's a second very closely related question, and very, very quickly, there is this question, and I want you to stop, just suspend what we're talking about, and think about this for just a moment. One of the questions, you remember I've said again and again that it's so important for the historical record of the Bible. Your faith is grounded in history. It's the only faith in the world that's actually grounded in historical events. And those events are recorded in the Scripture. It's real history, right? And it's got to be coherent. And one of the very real questions which arises out of the narrative of the Gospels is, how in the world did Jesus get away with this? Now, it's going to become most crystallized in the triumphal entry, but throughout his ministry, here's what you got to understand. Rome, number one, is a rather newly minted empire. And what that means is that there are a lot of peoples and royal houses and so on that they vanquished. So in every corner of the far-flung empire, their great fear, and it's a legitimate fear, just because you're paranoid doesn't mean nobody's chasing you, you know. So the reason that their great fear is sedition, pretender kings. Here's this royal house that's now been vanquished, and they think that the Roman army isn't paying much attention, and so they try and thrust themselves back into power, and Rome will not put up with it. And I like to say there are three basic rules if you're living under Roman rule. Number one, don't raise your hand against Rome. But number two, if you do, we are going to put it down probably in hours, maybe days, but we are going to, and there's no, they don't worry about collateral damage. It's a primary strategy. As a matter of fact, the third principle is the blood's going to run for months. We'll put it down, but the blood's going to run for months because we're going to punish everybody. And so Rome would not tolerate pretender kings. And here's the thing, the one place in their empire where they had more seditious activity than anywhere else was Israel. And on top of that, the one place where it was the most difficult for them to put down sedition was Israel, because Israel is, I like to say, is like one big paintball arcade. You know what I'm saying? It's made for guerrilla warfare. And the Romans just don't know anything about that. They're the phalanx, you know, the big, and it's well, at any rate, it takes them years oftentimes. The last big revolt was in 6 A.D., and it took them 2 years to put it down. Now, by the way, that's not only an embarrassment to the Roman Empire, it's an encouragement to all these other little seditious groups. So Rome, there's no place where they're more concerned about sedition than in Israel. Sedition, pretender kings. And yet, now listen, the word Messiah is not a real important word in the Old Testament. 9 times it refers to the deliverer during the intertestamental period. That word, Christos, Mashiach, became in the Jewish mind what wrapped up all of their hope with regard to this promised seed of the woman deliverer. But above all things, Messiah means king. And yet Jesus goes about, now how did he get away with that? Does that make sense to you? It's a legitimate question, and you know who brings this up in his sleep, I think? Is Bart Ehrman. Do you know that name? You know, the number one go-to, deconverted evangelical, hates the Bible. And he loves it. This is silly, and especially the triumphal entry. The idea that Jesus rode into the city of Jerusalem and was received wildly as king, and neither Jewish nor Roman authorities did anything about it. How are you going to explain that? Well, I'm glad you asked, to be honest with you, because there is a biblical answer. Now, this isn't the whole answer, and I'm not going to spend any more time with it, but I'll just say this. Number one, without going into it at all, Bookman, John the Baptist. For several months, John received people who came down, believed his message, savingly believed his message, submitted to his version of the mikvah, I like to say, but submitted to immersion. And then what'd they do? They went back to their cities to wait. Tens of thousands. And so now everywhere Jesus goes, he's immediately received by people who would die for him. They've never met him. They didn't even know his name when they got baptized. Does that make sense to you? John the Baptist absolutely salt and peppered the whole Jewish world with people who had already committed to Jesus as Messiah. Does that make sense to you? Would die for him. That's why, now, he also was doing so many miracles that there was just kind of superficial popularity, but there was genuine commitment. So I think John the Baptist is huge. The other part of this is that Jesus, because he was wise as a serpent, remember that on Matthew 10? He never used he never took to himself the name Messiah. He knew that king, he knew that would just enable his Jewish enemies to go to the Romans and say, you got a king here. What Jesus does, he never uses that title. So clever. But what he does is take to himself again and again this or that passage of the Old Testament, title from the Old Testament, and he reads Isaiah 61 and Luke 4 and then says, this day is this scripture fulfilled in your ears, the most messianic passage of the Old Testament. What was Jesus' favorite title of himself? Son of Man, 81 times. Now think about that. Son of Man comes right out of Daniel chapter 7, where Daniel sees these four beasts, and then the Ancient of Days comes and takes his seat, and one like unto a Son of Man comes and is dispatched to establish. That's one of the most blessed and familiar messianic passages. Everybody knows, every Jewish person knows that the Son of Man is Messiah. But if you are angry with Jesus and you go to Pilate and you say, this guy's dangerous, he claims to be the Son of Man, what's Pilate going to say? Me too, what are you talking about, for heaven's sake? And that's very deliberate. So Jesus is so circumspect, but let's now, with all that background, forgive me, let's go to the triumphal entry. How did Jesus get away with it? So I got my two questions. Number one, how did he contrive to fulfill the promise of Luke 13, 34, and 35? And then secondly, how did he get away with it in this most, if you don't mind, crystallized issue of Roman fear? All right, I'm going to tell you. Are you ready? This is an exercise in harmonization. And I'll say this. In the last 6 months of Jesus' ministry, Matthew and Mark drop out. Only Luke and John are telling us these 6 months. This is harmony. This is every gospelist has a specific audience and specific function and so on. So Luke and John are telling us the story, and we're going to go back and forth, but we're not sucking anything out of our thumb, folks. All right, so how did, number one, Luke 17:11, and I'm giving it to you here on the screen, but Luke 17:11, in the course of his telling of this period, Luke simply says, it came to pass as he went to Jerusalem. All right, now let me back up. Where do I put this? Yeah. John 11 says, after raising Lazarus, Jesus went to Ephraim. That's where Luke picks the story up. And he says that when it came time to go to Jerusalem, he passed through the midst of Samaria and Galilee. Now, you know enough geography now to know that if you go through Samaria and Galilee, you got Jerusalem in the rearview mirror, right? And I'm telling you, different versions play around with this because it seems so confusing. Why, if he's about 7 miles north of Jerusalem, why would he go north through Samaria and Galilee? Well, let's just take the record for what it stands, what it says, and it could not be more explicit. It's twice explicit in the Greek, both case ending and preposition. He went through the midst of Samaria and Galilee. Well, what do I have here? So here is Ephraim. Can you see that at all? But it's on your page there, rather small. And all right, I've been through this. So Judea to the south, Samaria, that region to the north between Judea and Galilee from the valley of Jezreel to the north. And now, Jesus was a Galilean. Remember it says in Luke chapter 2 that each year his family would go to Passover. And so Jesus knew the habits of the Galilean Jews with regard to getting to Passover. He knows he's done it again and again. So this is their habit, and I've tried to represent it here. That arrowhead, can you see that? That represents the valley of Jezreel, the most important valley on the face of the earth. We go to Israel, we spend a whole day just working on the valley of Jezreel because it's so very important. And I mean, across the board, but with regard, all right, so at any rate, the valley of Jezreel is the southernmost part of Galilee. So the Jews, they can't go to Samaria. It's dangerous, especially at feast season. Luke chapter 9, I mentioned that he had standing, but Luke 9, where he is making his way down to the Feast of Tabernacles, you remember he comes to one Samaritan village and they would not receive him because they knew it was feast season. And John and James want to call down fire. But the next verse says, so he went to the next village. So the point is that the Jews are not going to go to Samaria, but Jesus has standing. That's what I'm saying. And so he makes his way through Samaria. And, all right, so here's the habit of the Jews. Now watch this. There will be a quiz. It's called the Bema Seat. I don't know. You'll be there a long time before this comes up. But here's the point. The Jews, you never traveled, no matter what road you're going to take, you never traveled alone. So you always gather synagogues, families, clans, or whatever, and they would come down to the valley of Jezreel and gather, and then they had two routes by which they might make their way down to Jerusalem. And the first one is called, okay, here they come. I can see them there. Okay, you can't see it, but you see that? It's called the Ridge Route. This is the way of the patriarchs. This is the only north-south interior route in the hill country of Israel. And this is the route that Abraham took. It's the route that the forces of the IDF took. And when they invaded Jerusalem, this is the way you travel north and south. It's about 60, 70 miles. Here's a little help. From the northern border of the northern shore of the Dead Sea to the southern shore of the Sea of Galilee. It's almost dead on 60 miles. So you can kind of extrapolate that everywhere you go. So at any rate, they're going to be a little longer than that. And again, this is called the Ridge Route because it follows a series of ridges that most ridges don't go anywhere. But at any rate, very quickly, the point is it goes through Samaria. That's the route you would like to take. Excuse me. I don't want to sneeze right in here. That's the route you would like to take, but it passes through Samaria. So the second route, now watch this, is the Rift Route. What's that? Well, okay, I'm back to the Ridge Route. On the other hand, because it passes through Samaria, the second route, now, can you see the arrowhead? Barely. You can see it's got a shaft. That's a different valley. It's called the Harod Valley. And they would make their way down the Harod Valley into the Jordan Rift. And then you always travel on the east side of the rift if you're going north and south. So they would make their way down. And, of course, they're avoiding Samaritan territory, and the Jordan River is the border. They'd make their way down the rift. You got that? Listen, that rift. All right, in Israel, it's basically from Mount Hermon down to the Dead Sea, the bottom of the Dead Sea. It's called the Jordan Rift. It's also called the Syro-African Rift because it's about 1,400 miles, and it goes from Syria all the way to Central Africa. It's the deepest cleft on the face of the earth. It's a tectonic cleft. But its deepest spot is right here. So they make their way down the rift, and then they cross the Jordan. They ford the Jordan once again at Jericho, and they make their way up to Jerusalem, up the backside of the Mount of Olives. All right, now, when the Bible says that, here, I'll just do it on the screen. When the Bible says that he went through the midst of Samaria and Galilee, let's just take it for what it says. He made his way, I would argue, so I'm emphasizing that, I guess. He made his way with his disciples, going north, but he can get away with it because he has a standing, up to the Jezreel Valley, up to the midst of Galilee. Now, I would argue that there probably, we don't know for sure where, but somewhere, most likely there in the Jezreel Valley, Jesus and his disciples simply joined one of these traveling bands, if you don't mind, of Passover pilgrims. So you got these people that are making their way down, and it'll take them 6 or 7 days, and it's about 90 miles. The ridge route is about 60 miles. This is about 90 miles. And it includes that horribly difficult climb from Jericho. Remember I said yesterday, 4,000 feet, up to over the Mount of Olives. But so Jesus and the 12, fall in with one of those. And now, for several days, like I say, it's going to take 5 or 6 days at the least. He's going to make his way, just as we said, down the valley of Herod, down the Jordan, through the rift, and then we know he's going to cross through Jordan, through Jericho. This is the route that would take you through Jericho. And remember, in Jericho, first of all, he heals 2 blind men, and then he encounters a tax collector named Zacchaeus, all that on this trip. Does that make sense to you? But now he makes his way, and I'm asking a question. Number one, how did he get away with it? Well, he traveled with these. All right, but then how did he fulfill that prophecy? John 12, again, we got Luke and John here. John says that 6 days before the Passover, Jesus came to Bethany. All right, now hear me. 6 days before the Passover, I've done a lot of work on this. Harold Honer was my professor at Dallas Seminary, and I wrote a couple of papers for him. He didn't agree with them, but nonetheless, I spent a lot of time. He has this Palm Monday thing going on, but I spent a lot of time researching it carefully, and I will argue very forcefully. 6 days before the Passover is Friday. The Passover is Thursday, all right? 6 days before the Passover, he comes to Bethany. Now, that means it's Friday. And what's going to happen, all right, I'll just leave it there. This is what's going to happen. He's been traveling with these Passover pilgrims. I imagine that the group is getting larger. If I was in the next group back and heard that the miracle worker was up there, because he's doing miracles along the way. And so you can imagine the excitement on this. Now, Friday, he gets to Bethany. When the sun goes down on Friday, Shabbat begins. Jesus stops in Bethany. He had just raised Lazarus from the dead a few weeks earlier. Everybody knew about this. And now here you are. You're making your way up. And there's, to this day, as you come up, it's a different road. It doesn't follow the Wadi anymore. But as you come up the steep road from Jericho up to Jerusalem, just before you crest the Mount of Olives, there's a road that goes off to the south. So here's Jesus. He and his disciples. Everybody watches him. Have a nice day. They know exactly what's going on. It couldn't be other that he's going to keep the Sabbath there. But these people do not. They don't want to go to Bethany. They want to get into Jerusalem. And they have to get into Jerusalem before the sun goes down. Now, here's what you know, that one of the rabbinical protocols that they were pretty serious about was what's called a Sabbath day's journey. And understand, it's about a mile, and it's different between a mile and a quarter. And it was calculated by how much land an ox could plow in a day. So you take that and stretch it out, and that's a day's work. And so if you go past that, I don't know. But at any rate, it's not linear. It's not that you got to count your steps, and when you use up those steps, you got to sit down and wait for the sun to go down. It's a zone. And wherever you are as the sun goes down on Friday, you describe a circle around yourself, a radius of about a mile. You can move around freely. But if you're outside that circle, you see what I'm saying? You can't come in. And the rabbis were so punctilious about this that they would mark all the roads. There was a Sabbath zone for a city like Jerusalem, and they would mark the roads with a little stone marker. And you got to get inside that zone before the sun goes down, or you can't come in until Saturday when the sun goes down. Does that make sense to you? So, here's my point. Think about it. We're asking, how did Jesus get away with it? And in point of fact, he is careful. He contrives. He's wise as a serpent. He goes to keep the Sabbath with Lazarus. All of these people go into the city. What is everybody asking in that city? See the point? Is Jesus going to come to the feast? Well, here are several hundred excited people who get their Warholian 15 minutes, if you know what I'm saying. They got the answer. And I say on your sheet, all these, probably by now, thousands of excited people who have been traveling with the Nazarene for several days, some of whom have been healed along the way. And now they're going to go into that city. The city is abuzz with the question, do you think Jesus will come? And they have a twofold message. Number one, quite simply, he is coming. We know he's coming. We've been traveling with him. He is coming. But the second one is this. He'll be here Sunday morning. How do we know this? He stopped in he stopped in Bethany to be with Lazarus. He can't come in until late Saturday. He's not going to do that. So he will be here Sunday morning. And now that message begins to percolate through that entire. There are various estimates. They are really rather staggering as to how many people were probably in the city of Jerusalem, in the regions of the city of Jerusalem. See, Passover, you wanted to celebrate it with a sacrifice. You could not offer that sacrifice anywhere except at the temple. And then it says in the Bible that you have to eat the sacrifice in the place where God has placed his name. And the rabbis had decided, I think there's some wisdom in it, that what that was to be understood as you had to be within eyesight of the temple. Now, it's curious. I shouldn't go here, but it's so fascinating to me. Both in Shiloh, where the tabernacle was for 350 years, and then on the Temple Mount in Jerusalem, in both those places, the place where the tabernacle and then the temple stood is surrounded on almost 360 degrees by hill higher than itself. And so quite clearly, I love to go to Shiloh, and we can go to the place, and you can stand in the very spot where Hannah stood when she prayed that prayer. But there's a gal I got to know, her name is, at any rate, she lives there, and now you get a guide and so on. But it was a little more primitive back then. And she was showing us around, and she said that her father, who had lived there all of his life, it's right in the middle of what was the West Bank, of course, but it's a very, very Jewish area. And she said that he would love to explore all of those hills all around. And he said, everywhere you go, they pulled more pottery shards out of Shiloh, truckloads, than anywhere else in Israel. And she said, on all those hills, you'd see everywhere. You just pick up these pottery shards off the earth. But he said, as soon as you crest the hill, you don't find any pottery shards. Well, you see, number one, the Jews never go anywhere without a tent on their back. That's how they travel in antiquity. Not today, but in antiquity. And so in most cases, you would go to Jerusalem, and it was crowded beyond what you can imagine, but you could find a spot on those hills and pitch your tent, because you had to go have the lamb sacrificed and butchered. Then you had to go inside to keep the sow. So you could sew several tents together. I mean, you could bind several tents together. And you would, so my point is, and then in Shiloh, what would happen then is you would have a pottery dish to keep the feast, and then because it was a sacred feast, when you were done, you would break it. That's the pottery shards all around those hills. Well, come way back, Jesus is on the backside of the Mount of Olives. Oh, I know what I want to say. It's all of those hills around Jerusalem would have been, packed with Jewish pilgrims who had found a spot, and that's where they were going to keep the Passover and so on. But all of that within the Sabbath zone, so you could see you could keep it at a place where you could see the temple. All right. The point is that all of these hundreds of people, they go in, and they're bearing this message. He is coming. He'll be here Sunday morning. And what happened, I think, was that one by one, this family, this group, this synagogue, they get together and they say, listen, by the way, how many degrees of separation, can we still use that phrase? How many degrees of separation could there have been at this point in Jesus' ministry between anybody and somebody who was healed? There was nobody who didn't have a relative, a neighbor, or whatever, who used to be blind and now she can see. And so now, and there is this, and by the way, everybody acknowledges that at this point in world history, let alone Jewish history, there was just a fever pitch of messianic expectation because they loved the book of Daniel. And Daniel says there are going to be 4 kingdoms. And in the 4th kingdom, what's the 4th kingdom? Rome, And then you've got a ticking clock in Daniel chapter 9, the 70 weeks. So you've got this spirit, Messiah is soon to come. There's this Nazarene. My rabbi hates him. He insists he's not true and he's a faker and so on. But I do have a cousin who's been lame all of his life and he's hopping around. And why don't we just go see? He'll be here Sunday morning. And then you add to it the fact that there is if you don't mind, the political dynamic. It's hard to imagine how he's going to get away with this. What's going to be the reaction? This is the best show in town. Would you agree? So my point is, just one by one, these families, no concert, no internet, no planning. They just say, let's get it. There's only one road from Bethany to Jerusalem. So let's go and welcome and see what happens. And in the fever pitch of excitement, you can imagine, but it's real. These people are anxious. So at any rate, the point is, and this is all I'm going to say about the triumphal entry. The triumphal entry, and this is the outline we're going to use, and I'm going to cheat along the way, but I like to think of Sunday as a day of messianic presentation. At this level, that all throughout his ministry, Jesus has been carefully, circumspectly, but openly and persuasively claiming to be the Christ, the Messiah. But this is the one day of official. Like I say, this is Psalm 118:24. This is the day that only God could accomplish. When Messiah, the promised seed of the woman, the deliverer, finally makes his official appearance. So I think he is deliberately, dramatically presenting himself as Messiah. Does that make sense to you? And again, how did he get away with it? How did he fulfill that promise? And you know, don't work too hard at this, but be one of those Pharisees, those angry Pharisees. And you know, you had gone over there to Perea, and he'd kind of, I don't know, he put you in your place a little bit, and then he made this prophecy. And all the way back, you and your fellows, you made your way back to Jerusalem. You think, the man is insane. The man is crazy. It'll never happen. We're not going to let that happen. He's never going to be welcomed by this city as Messiah. This city is never going to cry out, blessed is he who comes in the name of the Lord. And now you watch as Jesus rides into the city, and the whole city explodes in happy welcome. And they're crying out, blessed is he who comes in the name of the Lord. Now, what's going to happen? A lot I'd like to talk about, but we don't have time. But Jesus is going to make his way down over the mount, do it your way, over the Mount of Olives, cross the Kidron Valley. Here's the Temple Mount. He's going to have to go way down south. I'll show you in a map. To the southern end of the city of David to find a gate. There's no gate on the eastern wall. There is a gate into the temple, but he doesn't go in there because he's here to present himself. Herod had totally rebuilt that portion of the city, the eastern portion, and he had built it specifically to receive hundreds of thousands of Jewish pilgrims because they brought their wallets. And I'm telling you, Herod made himself so wealthy he couldn't. I mean, he was not only building in Jerusalem, he was building all over the Roman Empire. He was building agora and imperial temples and so on with the money. And he had three sources of income. I shouldn't go into this, but number one is he was, as a 25-year-old young man, he was given the responsibility to vanquish that entire land and set aside the Hasmoneans, and he did that. And this is Pax Romana. Trade was exploding, and almost all of the caravans and merchants who made their way across the ancient world were funneled into that Jezreel Valley. And he controlled that Jezreel Valley, and therefore he could tax all of that. So that's where he began to grow wealthy. Secondly, he made a harbor. The first man-made harbor. It was beautiful. It was a work of engineering that boggles the mind to this day. But he captured the spice trade. The spices were basically like what oil is. I'm talking petroleum is today. Spices were the most, and they all came up from Saudi Arabia up through, and before Herod, they had to either go up to Tyre or down to Alexandria to find a port, but now he's got his own port. But the big cash cow was the temple. And so he had crafted this. And by the way, he had built it with two beautiful ceremonial walkways. Have you seen this that they've just uncovered? You can walk these today. They've uncovered them actually, they just opened them in the last several months. But you can walk on the pavement that Jesus would have walked up. But at any rate, so Jesus would come down, and the primary entrance was at the very southern end of the city of David. And so you would make your way, he would have come down all the way down the Kidron Valley, find that gate called the Dung Gate, unceremoniously enough. Gates in Israel to this day, Jerusalem, Israel, probably antiquity, but I know Israel. Gates are named for where they take you. So when we go to Jerusalem, we stay at a hotel just inside the Jaffa Gate. Well, that's where you go if you want to go down to Jaffa. It's on the western side. Damascus Gate on the north. The Dung Gate, there was a city dump just situated very well outside. So at any rate, and then Jesus would have walked up those walkways, and the Bible simply says he came up to the temple, he went in the temple, looked around, went back, and there's still all the excitement. So the whole day is just Jesus making his way up to the temple, back to Bethany, and the crowds rejoicing. That makes sense to you? But it is the day of messianic presentation. How did he get away with it? How did he contrive to fulfill that remarkable prophecy? It's his travel. He goes up, falls in with those pilgrims, makes his way down, lets them go into the city before him, and announce his coming, and now you have the wild scene. And don't go here, but there are so many attempts, not so many, but all of the attempts I've ever seen to explain it explain away. Listen, I'm going to tell you something. Don't spend any time trying to rescue the Bible from itself, okay? You don't have to somehow esoterically explain. Just take it for what it says, all right? And it says he went through Samaria and Galilee, then he came down the rift route. We know he did because of Jericho, and then he stopped in Bethany because John is explicit about that, and you got your explanations. That makes sense to you? How did he get away with it? How did he contrive? All right, one more question I want to ask you, and I probably have some notes here about no, I don't. All right, we're going to take a break, and the next big question we're going to ask is, given Sunday, why Friday? Does that make sense? Given the fact that the city erupts in happy welcome on Sunday, why is the same city crying, crucify him on Friday? That's a legitimate question. I mean, spiritually, historically, but just with regard to coherence. How can we explain this? I think we can. Let's take a break first, though. Now, are all in that Dropbox. So, and they'll go through each of these days in some detail, a lot of footnotes and endnotes and so on. So, but let's just introduce the drama. So I left you with this question. Given Sunday, we had a couple of questions. How do you get away with it and so on? All right, we understand that. Now, given Sunday, why Friday? And I will insist that the answer is Monday and Tuesday. And there's a lot that goes on these days. Basically, let me just walk through it. Here's Monday and Tuesday. Early on Monday morning, Jesus goes with his disciples from Bethany over the Mount of Olives, the Kidron, up into the Temple Mount. Along the way, he encounters a fig tree. He curses that fig tree because it has no figs. All right, and I'd love to talk about that. It's recorded in Matthew and Mark. There are some who find a discrepancy. There is no discrepancy. But at any rate, and then he goes in and he cleanses the temple for a second time. And then after he does that, that's on Monday, he goes back to Bethany. And then on Tuesday, he returns to the Temple Mount. And in one of the most exciting days, if you gave me, honest to goodness, one free ticket for one day on your newly invented time machine, honest, I think I go to Tuesday. It is the most staggering day, but we're not going to talk about it, so there. No, what happens is, on Tuesday, you see, Jesus' enemies have spent all night caucusing, trying to come up with something to derail this Jesus Express. And so they come and they begin to interrogate him. And Jesus puts them to silence. And then he appeals to Psalm 110 to prove his, all right, I'm going to walk you through some of that. But let me go back to the question, given Sunday, why Friday? And I believe the answer is Monday and Tuesday. And there is behind that, and it's actually one of those principles that I give you in the notes. It's not all that important, but if you go way back to the second page, I think I gave you those insights, I rather arrogantly call them, they seem to me. But, yeah, on page 1, actually, because the other's a cover. But number 6, I think, is, all right, and I'm going to read it to you, but this is what I'm developing, and it is a really important dynamic of Jesus' ministry and his rhetorical strategy, if you don't mind. Jesus, again and again, when there seems to be a willingness on the part of an individual, a rich young ruler, or a group, Jesus will test the genuineness of their willingness to follow him, their faith. All right, let me interrupt myself. We have horribly abstracted faith. It's not an abstract concept at all. Have we made it into just some sort of a mind thing where you, I don't know, you sit in a real, dark room, close your eyes. I really believe. I really do. No. Faith, I think the best synonym for the biblical concept of faith is allegiance. Now, go back to the Old Testament. Here's a nomadic people. They're tired of being nomadic. Here's a king with a walled city. Walled city is everything. Most of the kings in the Bible, I like to say, are kinglets, okay? They got a walled city and a domain. There's another walled city and another domain. But you're tired, and so you go, and we got several of these, and you as a people, you go to that king, and you make what's called a vassal treaty, suzerainty vassal treaty. And you say, all right, now we are going to live under your care, which sign a treaty, and we are going to give you our allegiance, which means two very closely related things. Number one, I'm going to depend upon you for security. You're going to take care of me. That's your job. You got a walled city. Number two, whatever you tell me to do, I'm going to do. Trust and obey. That's the biblical concept of faith. And it could not be more practical. You simply obey, even if it doesn't make much sense. But this is what the Bible says. Well, my point is, this is what Jesus is demanding, that you give him your allegiance. You're going to trust him. You're going to obey him. And when people seem willing to do that, and you can imagine with all the miracle working and so on, all the excitement, a lot of what turns out to be horribly superficial or and self-serving and so on. But he had a way of testing it, and that is he would make a difficult demand. I like to say he would speak hard words. Do you get to the kingdom? I was going to say heaven, but I don't like to talk about it. We're not bound for heaven. Heaven beats all the alternatives, but that's just a stopover. We're bound for a kingdom on this earth. But anyway, do you get into the kingdom by selling everything you have and giving to the poor? Of course not. But that young ruler, Jesus, and I was saying, Jesus was so intuitive. He could read you like a book, absent any appeal to the supernatural. He had a mind unclouded by sin. He knew the scriptures. And so again and again, Jesus, here is this or that person or this or that group. Luke chapter 4, when he reads, remember he goes back to his hometown, Nazareth, and he reads from the Isaiah scroll, and the people everybody's so excited. And the next thing Jesus says, I shouldn't go down there, but the next thing Jesus says is, in the Old Testament, didn't say that, okay. He says, there were many widows in Israel in Elijah's day, but Elijah ministered to a Syrophoenician widow. And there were many lepers in Elisha's day, but Elisha ministered to a Syrian leper. What's the next thing that happens? They want to throw him over a cliff. Now, I'll tell you what's at stake there. I shouldn't have gone here, but I got to explain it. Nazareth sits right above that Jezreel Valley. It's the perfect lookout spot. So the Romans had a small contingent of soldiers who lived there. They were mercenary. They didn't speak the language. They had a sword on their side. They were drunk half the time. Okay, who knows for sure? But you can imagine. And the Nazarenes had to live every day of their lives rubbing shoulders. And so they had with those Roman soldiers, and they just developed a hatred for Gentiles. And Jesus grew up in that village, and he knew that they had that ungodly. So when the Nazarenes, these are the people who know him best. He grew up there for 30 years. He's come back to his hometown. He's gone to the synagogue where his family had gone all of his life. And now they're all agog, local boy made good, and they're so excited, and they hear him claim to be Messiah. And the next thing he says is, God loves the Gentiles. Whoop, over a cliff. That makes sense to you? That's what's happening there. Same thing with the rich young. Now, here's what you need to understand. And I may give it to you here. I'm not going to go through this is Monday, Tuesday. Yeah, here it is. I told you this yesterday, but this is, and all of this is in that Dropbox folder. Are you intimidated by that? Every one of you can get to that Dropbox folder if you got a smartphone, okay? Just know. And you can download anything you want. But suffice it to say that, again, Pharisees and Sadducees. Pharisees ran the synagogue. It was de facto. It wasn't de jure. The scribes and Pharisees were joined at the hip. A scribe is a guild. It's a profession. Copyists. Very, very important in that day. These scribes copied the Torah. You couldn't have a synagogue. You can't to this day have a synagogue that doesn't have a scroll, handwritten manuscript of the Torah. And so, and the Pharisees, of course, claimed they loved the law. So Pharisees and scribes were joined at the hip. You couldn't have a synagogue without a Torah scroll. And so just functionally, de facto, the Pharisees, and what is important, and notice what I say there, that they were revered and feared. I say respected, but it's almost revered. Look, this is important. The Pharisees, I know there's a lot of debate about this. I think I've done my homework. The Pharisees were law keepers. Now, the debate is that under the heading of a thing called the New Perspective on Paul, it's a long story, this idea was developed that no, the Pharisees were not really keeping the law in order to be justified. That's not true. Well, the fact is that that's exactly what they were doing. They taught, and the argument was, well, you read the rabbis. All right, we're getting into the Talmud, which is much later. It's a totally different thing. But nonetheless, you read the Jewish literature, and they talk all the time about grace. All right, now, please don't mishear me, because I probably have a less negative attitude than you, but the Catholic Church talks about grace all the time. You read their official literature on salvation, everything is grace. The point is, God's so gracious, he gave us the sacraments. And all we have to do is keep the sacraments. The Pharisees are an immediate parallel. God's so gracious, he gave us the Mosaic law. And the more carefully we keep the law, the more certain we are to satisfy God's demands and get into the kingdom. Now, here's the thing. The Pharisees, and by the way, when the temple was destroyed in 70 AD, only one sect survived. I can walk you through the whole thing. It's the Pharisees. And modern rabbinical Judaism is a stunningly exact replication of the Pharisees of Jesus' day. Honest to goodness, it's really stunning. But the point is that just as modern day Hasidic Jews, the ultra-Orthodox, they don't work, they never work, they don't have a job, and because their calling is to spend 24 hours a day studying the law and finding how to be more and they don't study Moses, they study the fathers, okay? They study their own writings. But my point is that in Jesus' day, you have these Pharisees, and they dressed rather distinctively. There was nothing official. You didn't get a laminated card, it was just you live this way, you become part of the fraternity. It was a fraternity. And they were 24, that's all they did, is keep the law. So you're saying to yourself, if anybody's making it in, he's making it in. And here's the thing. If you support your Pharisee, give alms, and so on, you can ride his coattails into the kingdom. You don't have time to give all day long to just working at the law, but he does. And if you help him, you get in. Now, that's what Jesus is dealing with. The Pharisees, that's why I say they were revered, but they were feared, John 9, because if you made them mad, they could toss you out of the synagogue, apo synagoge. Now, listen, you don't want to be tossed out of, your church, shame on you. But this is really a different deal. Because remember the Sabbath day journey, the Sabbath zone concept? It's for that reason that, like even in Nazareth, it's a small village, but there probably would have been 2 or 3 synagogues because they were Baptist synagogues. No, I'm a Baptist, so I can get away with that. But the point is that you cluster your homes around the synagogue because you want to be able to get up on Saturday morning. There are services on Saturday, Monday, and Thursday. And on Saturday, on Shabbat, you want to be able to go to Sabbath and to the synagogue. And you got to live within the Sabbath day's journey. Does that make sense to you? So if you get tossed out of the synagogue, yeah, you're probably not. And the synagogue, I hope you understand, it's not a church, it's not a temple, it's a gather, synagogue. It's a place where you come together. And it's your whole life is built around your synagogue. You just want to. Are you Fiddler on the Roof fans? If not, for heaven's sakes, what's wrong with you? But remember, Tevye, all day long I'd sit with the doctors. That's what you long to do in the synagogue. So my point is that the Pharisees had a club. They were a club, but they had a club they hit you on the head with, and that is they can toss you out of the synagogue. Now that's huge. The Sadducees, on the other hand, they're unbelievers. They're despised. They run the temple because they have purchased that right from Rome. They have promised to produce X number of drachma every year, and they get what's left over. And so, and they're all right. So, here, come way back. Where was I? My point is that it is very much. I'm asking the question given Sunday, why Friday? And I'm answering it this way, Monday and Tuesday, because on those 2 days, Jesus dramatically demonstrates his messianic identity, and then he drives the people to a decision. Now, I left out a point. My point is, again and again in his ministry, he uses this rhetorical strategy. Somebody seems to want to follow him, and he puts his finger on their most sensitive spiritual nerve. Not because they want to make life difficult. He's testing the genuineness of their allegiance. That makes sense to you? Well, at this point in history, in the providence of God, you have this remarkable foil against which Jesus can, in fact, compare himself and drive people to a decision. It's me or the Pharisees. Does that make sense to you? Now, I'm going to walk through Monday and Tuesday, and on Tuesday afternoon, as he leaves the Temple Mount, Jesus is going to preach what we have in Matthew 23. Woe unto you, scribes and Pharisees. Remember that? You compass. And notice, by the way, he never mentions the Sadducees. It's not because the Sadducees aren't just as crooked as the Pharisees, but nobody wants to be like the Sadducees. But the issue is, you can't turn to God without turning from idols. And in this case, the idol is the pride of accomplishing your own entrance into the kingdom through the Pharisees. And what Jesus is saying is, it's me or the Pharisees. And given the role that the Pharisees play throughout the land in every little village, it's a very telling demand. Does that make sense to you? All right, let me walk you through real quickly. So on Monday morning, Jesus does, in fact, for a second time, cleanse the temple. Now, I think you're familiar with it. I give you some pictures here. I guess earlier. Yeah, that's the model of the temple. I don't know if you're familiar. I'm not going to spend a lot of time with it. This is Herod. Listen, the Jews have two temples in their history. They want a third temple. Don't have anything to do with it. But the first temple built by Solomon, destroyed by Nebuchadnezzar. Second temple, 50 years later, built by Zerubbabel, remodeled by Herod, and destroyed by Vespasian in 70 AD, right? That second temple, the rabbis used to say, the Talmud says that, now don't be confused here, there are only two temples, but there are two stages to the second temple, Zerubbabel and Herod, right? So they will say that Herod's temple was as much more beautiful than Solomon's as Solomon's was more beautiful than Zerubbabel's, because Zerubbabel's was a horrible disappointment, a little wooden structure. So my point is that Herod, I could go on and on about it, but he reconstructed the temple. Don't go anywhere, Bookman. But here, this area here, that entire Temple Mount. Now this is the temple. That's the actual. It's the dimensions of the tabernacle. It's the same dimensions as far as it has to be. But the vast court of the Gentiles, as it was called, this right here, was 36 acres. How much ground you got here? About 8 acres. So 36 acres. That's huge. Oh, don't get me started. But the point is, Herod's a fascinating guy. He's one of the greatest genius. He was an architect. Josephus insists that when Herod would build these, Josephus makes the point that Herod loved to defy nature. Usually, a good engineer, architect, builder will work with nature. Figure out he loved to defy nature. So he would build, for instance, a harbor and Caesarea Maritima on the coast where there was no fresh water. But he would build a beautiful aqueduct system from 18 miles away. He'd go to Mount Carmel and he'd find some springs and he'd build a man-made lake that was high enough that he could build an aqueduct system that in 18 miles drops about a foot. And by gravity, he could bring all. Sometimes it's an aqueduct, sometimes it's on the earth, sometimes it's going through a mountain. And in order to build this, he had to build an artificial hill, and there's a stone in his structure right about here that weighs, they think, about 50 tons. We could not move it today. It's the third course up. There are two courses below it, and then it was placed on top. It was quarried somewhere and brought there. I stood next to it one time with I was one of the guys who was traveling. He was from Seattle. He'd worked on cranes, all of his life. He knew everything there was to about cranes. And I asked him, Rick, he said, if I had two, I could reposition. I could not move that from one place to another. And we couldn't. There's nothing we have today that can do it, but Herod did. So, and Josephus insists that, why did I talk about Herod? But that Herod was not just, and people think, well, he had a lot of slaves. He didn't use slaves. People were coming from all over the Roman world because this is where artisans, engineers, architects were coming from all over the world because there was so much good work to be done, and he paid handsomely, thank you. But Josephus says that when they encountered an insurmountable problem and they had to work it out, He didn't just watch. He was a primary voice and came up with the solution. So Herod he's an amazing man, but of course he became absolute power, and so, but at any rate, what am I talking about? This is for a second time, because this is these walkways, I don't know if you can see them, but they emerge from, you enter in gates down below because it's on a high hill, and you come up a stairway, and then you emerge, and underneath the Temple Mount, there were huge, because there are, I think 60-some 80-foot piers that hold the Temple Mount up on the southern end, because it's 40 feet above the earth, above bedrock. All right, what in the world? My point is that and we talked about this before, in this court of the Gentiles is evidently where they set up shop, selling the Sadducees did, selling the lambs and changing the money and so on. So for the second time, Jesus goes in. Now listen, I told you before, there is marvelous strategy in this, and I've already been here. But I said that in the first, John 2, John records the first cleansing. Matthew, Mark, and Luke all record the second cleansing that happens on Monday. In the first cleansing, Jesus catapulted himself into Jewish worldwide notoriety. And he also, think about this, remember now, you got the Sanhedrin, and really they can't move against Jesus unless they can get the Romans involved, and the only body through which they can approach the Romans is the Sanhedrin. Are you with me? It gets a little complicated. And the Sanhedrin is about, at this time, evenly divided between the Pharisee and Sadducee. Now they hate each other's guts. But when Jesus cleanses the temple the first time, again, whose territory is he walking on? The Sadducees. So you can bet they were madder than hops, but the Pharisees, they were enjoying this. But now for the next 3 years, Jesus doesn't bother the temple at all. He goes, but he never cleanses the temple. But he is going from synagogue to synagogue. Now whose territory? You see? And you can watch it happen in the Gospels, that the Pharisees are getting more and more angry. And I imagine, I don't think it could be otherwise, that they were probably going to the Sadducean brethren and saying, you need to help us here. We need to be rid of this guy. And, of course, the Sadducees are thinking, hey, what do I care? When it was my ox getting gored, you weren't any help. When Jesus cleansed the temple on Monday, he galvanized the hatred of the Sadducees and the Pharisees. Now it's going to take him 5 days to get him on a cross. That's what's going on. Jesus is signing his death warrant. On the other hand, there could be no more dramatic or unmistakable claim to messiahship than to take possession of the temple. Malachi 3 says that the messenger of the new covenant will come suddenly to his temple. Ezekiel has a whole section on the temple from which Messiah is going to. Everybody knew that the Messiah would rule from the temple. And now for 2 days, because when he cleansed it in John, he just walked away. Now he not only cleanses it, but he possesses it for 2 days. So he comes back in the morning, and like I say, now let me just say quickly, if you want to, in this culture, I don't know the answer to this today, but if you want to prove, you guys, that you're a man among men, what do? You maybe arm wrestle, push-ups, whatever in the world. I'm telling you, and I could tell you stories about this. It's fun. In a Jewish world, you want to prove yourself a man among men, you put your enemy to silence in open debate. There is nothing more heavyweight, more dramatic, the Jewish world. To prove you're a really worthy man. Jesus' enemies come. I got to tell you a little bit about it, but they come and they challenge him. I'm just going to walk you through it. First of all, the Sadducees come. And they ask him, now you got to understand this. They ask him, by what authority? And this is public. This is not some private. He's healing. He's teaching. All of these stoa, you see with all these pillars, Those are called stoa or porches, like in the Stoics, that's where they'd hang out and so on. And they're designed acoustically. And this right here is Solomon's porch. Remember Acts chapter 3 that Peter and John are on their way there because that's where the early Christian community was gathering. Remember that? So this is wide open. It's 24 hours a day. You can come in here and gather where you will. And I'll tell you one other thing. I mentioned before that in the Bible you're dealing with an oral culture, and they know how to listen in big groups. They know how to pass it along. So there's no other show in town. Jesus yesterday cleansed the temple for the second time. His enemies, the Pharisees, are so mad they can't see straight. But now Jesus comes back, and again, it's by reason of his popularity. When Jesus cleansed the temple, the people would have been absolutely beyond expression delighted. So now they're more impressed with this Nazarene, and so he comes back, and his enemies can't touch him because he's so wildly popular. Let me tell you one other thing. There is tremendous wisdom in his spending every night at Bethany. Every night he would go back to Bethany. There is, and this is reflected in the Bible, it gets a little untasteful, but there is an element of what's called Jewish hospitality. Not Jewish, Near Eastern. And that is, it's hospitality. If I accept you as a guest in my home, I become absolutely, to whatever degree, responsible to protect you. And I would sooner die or have my loved ones die than let it be known that I gave you shelter and then you were able to be stolen away. Does that make sense to you? This is Lot's daughter. This is the priest in Judges 19 and so on. And so the point being, I don't think it's a particularly noble thing, by the way. But on the other hand, it's part of that culture. So when Jesus goes back to Bethany, Bethany's a little village, and they love Jesus. Just a few weeks ago, he brought back from the tomb one of their citizens there in town. And so Jesus came, and it's right on the road. There's always going to be a lot of traffic. So Jesus is carrying himself in such a way that they can't seize him in private. Does that make sense to you? But now, come back to it. Jesus comes back, and first of all, the Sadducees. Tuesday morning, huge crowds. Jesus is teaching miracles, and now they come and interrupt him and say, Master. And this is, listen. Today, a rabbinical training school is called a yeshiva. Have you ever heard of that? Y-E-S-H-I-V-A. And I worked so hard for a long time to get into an Orthodox yeshiva. I wanted to see it happen. And it's a long story, but I finally, there was a guy, I was on a trip, and he took me to a yeshiva that was kind of off by itself, and it was a room about twice this size, but it had a loft with glass, so we weren't in the room. That's how it could go, but we could hear what was going on. And the guide was showing it, and the room was full of double podia. So it was like this, and there was a young rabbinical student here and a rabbinical student there, and our guide said that what would happen is in the morning, the rabbi would come in and he would pose a difficult question. And he used this illustration. He said, maybe the Bible says explicitly that if you got an ox and it rips up your neighbor's garden, you got to pay for the garden, right? What about if you got an ox and you go down and you buy a good stout rope and you tether your ox, but the rope breaks and he rips up? Who's got to pay for the garden? The guy who owns the ox or the guy who sold you the rope? And so you take the guy with the rope and you take the guy with the ox. And they're going at it. And I'm up here watching it. They're playing, and they're running over and getting the big tomes and opening it and so on. And he said the rabbi just walks around and listens. And then he says a lot of times he'll say, okay, switch places. Now you take the rope and you take the ox. And you got to go. So that's how they, it's huge. Well, that's what's going on. And so these Sadducees come. And they say, tell us by what authority to do these things. Now you got to understand what's really at stake here, and that is they want him to say, I am the Messiah. And then they got him. They're happy. They're going to go to Rome, and they're going to go to Pilate and say, you got trouble. He's claiming to be a king. Jesus knows that. So clever. He says, and this is perfectly legitimate. This is rabbinical argument. He says, all right, I'll ask you a question. The baptism of John, was it of heaven or was it of men? And so the Sadducees go over and they say, no, wait a minute. If we say it was of heaven, then we got our answer. because John announced him as Messiah, and if he's genuinely Messiah, he has a right. But if we say of men, these people will kill us because they love John the Baptist. And they go back and they say, Master, we have no answer. The place would have erupted. There'd have been huzzas and cheers and so on. And then the Pharisees with their woman with the Pharisees with the paying tribute to Caesar, and Jesus puts them to silence, and they come back. And then the Sadducees again, they don't believe in the resurrection. The woman with the 7 husbands and all that sort of stuff. And I'd love to walk through it all, but in every case they come back and they say, you have answered well. Now again, he cleanses the temple, he takes possession, and then he demonstrates his stunning wisdom in putting to silence each of these leadership groups and so on. By the way, and then I love this story. I'd love to spend time on it. But a young law student, it's called a lawyer, but it means he's a student of the law, asks Jesus, and it's a very different spirit. The others were trying to trap him in his words. And he asks him, what's the greatest commandment? You know, this is a question that falls under the category of teaching Moses on one leg. The Jews would use that expression of, all right, here's a rabbi, claims to know the law. Ask him to summarize the whole thing. Teach Moses in the time you can stand on one leg. Does that make sense to you? Kind of sum it all up. And Jesus says, love the Lord God, love your neighbor. And that young law student says, you have answered well. And then he says this, because to love the Lord your God and love your neighbor is greater than all the sacrifices. That is the antithesis of what the Pharisees taught. Didn't matter how you lived, as long as you kept the Pharisees. Now that's a stunning insight. And remember, Jesus was blown away himself, and he said, you are not far from the kingdom of God. Remember that? I think, and we'll check when we get there, I think we can identify that young. I think that was Saul of Tarsus. I think we know he was in town studying under Gamaliel. Later on, when he on the road to Damascus, of course, the Lord says to him, it's hard for you to kick against the ox goads. Certainly, young Saul, everything we know about it, he'd have been pursuing, he'd have been there whenever he could, and I think this was maybe one of those ox goad moments. But anyway, leave that alone. It's just there's more to it. And then Jesus he goes to Psalm 110 and proves his messiahship from Psalm 110, his deity, and he speaks these parables of judgment, a parable of the man, the man with 2 sons, parable of the vineyard, what shall he do to these husbandmen, and so he tells those 3 parables of the man who led his vineyard out to husbandmen and the 2 sons and then the wedding feast. And then he witnesses, well, let me take you to Matthew 23. All right, where am I going? I'm saying, given Sunday, why Friday? I think the answer is Monday and Tuesday. Jesus had a very effective, what I call rhetorical strategy. He uses it again and again, by which he would test the willingness of people, what seemed to be the willingness of people to follow him. When he rode into the city, the whole city had welcomed him as Messiah. He's going to put that to the test. And so on Tuesday afternoon, he preaches his last sermon. As a matter of fact, he's going to leave the city after this, and the next time he leaves the city, he'll be carrying a cross. But in Matthew, chapter 23, you have this extended, Jesus spoke to the multitudes. All right, now let's make sure, get in a moment. This is sometime late, probably Tuesday afternoon. He has cleansed the temple, possessed the temple. Mark says that he wouldn't so much as allow a man to carry a vessel of water across the temple. Now, we don't know exactly what's at stake there, but probably shortcuts. You can imagine that vast thing, one gate, out the other. He was in charge of that 36-acre Temple Mount with his disciples, undoubtedly. This was a very deliberate thing. But you could not, I want to say it again, you could not have a more dramatic and unmistakable messianic claim than to take control of the temple. And then he's proved himself. So now, before he leaves, he spoke to the multitude, saying, and I'm not going to read all of it. It's stunning. It is absolutely stunning. But I've highlighted several of the woes. Woe to you, scribes and Pharisees, you play actors. And it's again, he never mentions the Sadducees. But the scribes and Pharisees, you shut up, king. The Pharisees taught, they love to refer to them. This is Edersheim, and I still trust Edersheim. But he says that one of the nicknames for the sobriquets, if you don't mind, that the Pharisees would use is gatekeeper. Good morning, fellow gatekeeper, because they thought not only we keep the law so carefully, not only are we certain to get into the kingdom, but God will use us to decide who else gets into the kingdom. We'll keep the gate. And now Jesus says to him, you shut up the kingdom of heaven against men. You're not going in, and you don't allow others to go. You hypocrites. You devour. All right, I'm not going to go through all of them, but look at this. Verse 15. You travel land and sea to win one proselyte. When he is won, you make him twice as much a son of hell as yourselves. Can you imagine? Now again, yesterday, it was all exciting, and you heard about his coming, and you got up early, and you went, and it was such an exciting day. We welcomed, we threw down our garments and so on. And you've been pretty impressed with today. He's been healing people. He's been putting his enemies to silence. But now you stand up, wait a minute. He's talking about my Pharisee. This is my ticket to the kingdom. And so you blind guides. Well, again, you you blind guides who strain out a net and swallow cum. I'm going to tell you something. That's hilarious. Jesus had a rich sense of humor. And the place would have erupted in, derisive laughter. Is it such a beautiful picture? Everybody knew the Pharisees were lechers. They were so immoral, but they kept the law punctiliously, and so they're going to get in. And so, and by the way, what's at stake here is that the law said that you if you could see an insect, it was unclean. If you couldn't, don't worry about it. And so they would very publicly, they'd have their housekeeper go out and stand in the yard, stand in the street, and whatever they're going to eat, if it was a piece of lettuce, they would wash it, and then they'd hold it up in the sun, look on both sides, and so on. So they were so careful to strain out the smallest gnat, but they'd swallow a camel. Outside of the cup is unclean. Whitewashed tombs, by reason of the fact that a tomb would, if you got up against a tomb, you were Levitically unclean. But the tomb was usually just somewhere in the back 40, and you might be making your way up to Jerusalem for the Passover, and maybe you've got that rolling stone, it's kind of grown over, and you got a little rest, and somebody comes along and says, hey, you're leaning up against Granddad's tomb. Too bad for you. You can't keep the feast. And so the Sanhedrin had declared that at feast season you had to go out and just slap a lie, just white lie on so people would recognize it as a tomb. And like I say, the city was on the Mount of Olives itself was always huge with tombs. So I imagine Jesus kind of sweeping his hand across the horizon and saying, "You're like so many whited sepulchres. You look good, you clean, but inside you're full of dead men's bones." That means you think about impurity. The Jews do not do well with abstractions. So impurity, what it means is you stink. That's the idea. If you're impure, you stink in God's nostrils. And so that's what Jesus is saying. You make God sick. You look good, but inside you're full of dead men's bones. You make God sick. I mean, these are not words, I always say, calculated to endear Jesus to the Pharisaic fraternity, right? But at any rate, each one of them is so interesting. But he winds up by saying, scribes and Pharisees, you build, I'm looking for, right here. You are witnesses against yourself. You are the sons of those who murdered the prophets. Fill up then the measure of your father's guilt. You serpents, you brood of vipers, how can you escape the condemnation of hell? What's going on? Given Sunday, why Friday? The answer is Monday and Tuesday. And the point is that Jesus, having demonstrated his messianic identity, now drives that city to a decision. Time out. This is the Sermon on the Mount. I know everybody who teaches the Sermon on the Mount thinks he understands it better than anybody else. I'm no exception, forgive me. But the whole point of the Sermon on the Mount, the key verse is, oh, listen, this would have been so staggering. I'd love to set the scene. I can take you to the place almost certainly where thousands of people, many of them have been healed. Jesus goes up on a hillside and actually calls his disciples, and they assume the posture that we talked about before. And when that happened, all the people down here, with all the excitement, shh, the rabbi's going to speak. He's just assumed the posture, and he begins to speak. And he says, unless you're, and I like to say, you won't understand Matthew 5-7 or Matthew 23 unless you see Jesus pointing. Because here are all these people in Matthew 5-7, Sermon on the Mount. Here's this little gaggle of Pharisees. And he starts out by saying, unless your righteousness exceeds that of the scribes and Pharisees, you'll never glimpse the kingdom of heaven. Oh, the place would have exploded in a gasp. And I think it's the same thing. And by the way, the rest of it is what? They say unto you, but I say unto you. Again, and then an invitation. There's a broad way, leads straight to hell, or there's a narrow way. You can build your house on the sand, help yourself, or you can build it. So again, Jesus knows that by reason of the cultural and religious dynamics of this people, that to demand that they turn from the Pharisees is going to be staggering. And he's doing it here. So I'm saying to you, given Sunday, why Friday? I would argue that the answer is Monday and Tuesday. And that specifically what Jesus does is drive this city to a horribly difficult but defining decision. It's difficult because those Pharisees are nasty guys. And because we're trusting in them to get us into the kingdom. It's defining because you're going to put on display where your real allegiance is. Are you really willing to follow Jesus? Now, this is Tuesday afternoon. I got to talk to you about a couple other things. But Jesus is going to leave the city. He's going to see the widow's mite. Oh, I'd love to talk to you. He's going to weep over the city once again. As he goes back to Bethany, his disciples are going to say, wow, look at those stones, and he's going to preach the Olivet Discourse of Matthew 24 and 25. But he has left the city with a decision. On Friday morning, we're going to talk about this after a break. On Friday morning, in the course of the trials, Pilate is going to say to the city, who would you have me give you, Jesus or Barabbas? At that point, they're going to announce their verdict. He's driven them to a decision. By Friday morning, they go home, they think about this. I don't know. That's a bridge too far. Give us Barabbas. Does that make sense to you? That's what's going on. Now, before we take a break, this is absolute criminal. But I want to talk about a couple of things. Number one, I'm not going to expand on this, but on Tuesday night, it's absolutely explicit in the record. On Tuesday night, look, I didn't mention this, but on Saturday night, so Jesus arrives in Bethany on Friday. Remember that? 6 days before the Passover. Keeps the Passover, and then on Saturday night, I realize there are a lot of issues about this, and I've dealt with them, and you can find, but I'm just going to say it was on Saturday night that they held a feast for Jesus at the home of a man named Simon. Simon the leper. Would you, if you got an invitation, come on over. I always say we're having finger food. No, that's a cheap joke. But the point, I know that's a Johnny joke. but the point is, at that feast, Mary anoints Jesus, and everybody in the house is horrified. Everybody. And Jesus very gently, I don't think there's any scolding here. He said, no. Leave her alone. She's done this against the day of my burial. I'll tell you something. Jesus, again and again, I can walk you through it, had told publicly, openly, privately to his disciples, I'm going to go to Jerusalem, so many things, and be killed. There was one person in the record who believed it. That was Mary. And that's why Jesus says, wherever this is, she'll be remembered. Because she actually believed Jesus. Well, Jesus very gently, I think, says, leave her alone. Don't scold her. And it wasn't directed at Judas, but there was one man whose heart, you know what? Sin makes you stupid. And I mean, it makes you stupid in the sense that morally, everything gets out of joint. And Judas was an unbeliever. He had more light than anybody ever lived. And yet, he loved his sin. He was a thief more than he loved what he knew to be the truth. That's how you get to hell, okay? You love your sin more than you love what you know very well to be the truth. And the fact is that he was harboring that, and it stung him. And so he was stung by that rebuke wasn't even to him, but on Saturday night. And so it simmered. I think maybe this is what Paul has in mind when he says, let not the sun go down on your wrath, neither give place to the devil. Because the devil used that, and he didn't take over Judas. Judas was a willing, victim or a participant. But at any rate, on Tuesday night, Judas sneaked off, and I won't get into it, but now you need to know this, because we're going to talk about it after the break. Caiaphas is the high priest. He's the true villain of this whole story. He and his family have a beautiful villa on a hill south of Jerusalem. Never part of Jerusalem. It's a deep valley, and then up on a hill. It's called to this day the Hill of Evil Counsel. That's the name of the hill, because it was evil counsel. That's where he went to make the bargain to kill Jesus. And by the way, just because you might enjoy this, the dominant feature on the Hill of Evil Counsel today, you can see it all over you. Look, there's a big building, is the UN. So I don't know, do what you want with that. But the fact is that Judas makes a bargain. And the bargain is, I'm going to say it again, we read it, Luke 22:6. They gave him money, and he promised to help them arrest him, Jesus, in the absence of the multitude. Now, folks, that does not mean that Judas is going to follow along, and just, throw up a flare or something when Jesus is alone. They know the next time Jesus is going to be in the absence of the multitude. It's at the Passover. And so Judas, and this happens on Tuesday night. By the way, when Judas gets there, the Pharisees are throwing, the Sanhedrin are throwing their hands in the air and saying, we got to kill him, but not during the feast, lest there be a riot. But along comes Judas, and I can help. So there is a plot laid to arrest Jesus in connection with his celebration of the Passover on Thursday night. Now, it's a huge plot. It involves a cohort of soldiers. And a lot of people scoff at that and say, why would you need to go? Well, number one, the primary concern of Rome is not that Jesus is going to fight back. That's a concern. But that there's going to be a riot. So the cohort of soldiers is, and then in the middle of the night, 70 very old men are going to gather for a trial. This is a culture in which when the sun goes down, you go down, okay? There's not a lot of life. Light is tough. So, and these are old men, but they're going to arrange to have a midnight hearing, a trial of sorts with the Sanhedrin, but then their plan is to take Jesus to Pilate for a legitimate Roman trial. He's going to be tried as a seditionist, and that's what I want to talk about after the break, and at about 4:30 in the morning. And so all of this has got to be, there are a lot of, so Wednesday is a silent day in the record, but it's a busy day because Jesus is, Judas, all these arrangements have to be made. Does that make sense to you? All right, one other thing, and then we'll take a break. And this is criminal, but I say criminal. We just have very limited time. So I take you back to it, and I walk all through this, the various, all right, so late Tuesday evening. Now, Monday and Tuesday, Sunday, presentation, triumphal entry, dramatic offer. Monday, Tuesday, given Sunday, why Friday, proclamation, I call it, just because I'm looking for an outline, for heaven's sakes, forgive me. But the fact is, he proclaims the truth so dramatically about himself and then drives the city to a decision. Tuesday night, Judas makes the deal. So Wednesday is a silent day in the record, but it is a very, very busy day because Thursday evening, what am I doing here? This is what I want to come to. Let me talk to you about this. It's in your notes. I want you to think of Thursday, primarily the afternoon, as a time of messianic preparation twice. First of all, in the upper room. So now very quickly, Jesus does, and you remember that when he tells, this is Luke 22:7, when he tells Peter and John, go prepare, they say, where? And he says, go into town, you'll find a man carrying a pitcher of water. Now, I know some people will think that this is omniscience or something. That makes no sense. What's that guy doing there, for heaven's sakes? I think another thing that happened on Silent Wednesday was that Jesus made preparation to keep the feast in the home of a woman named Mary, the mother of Mark, and sent probably, maybe called Lazarus, I need to borrow one of your servants, and got that servant assigned to go into town. There's a woman, she lives on the Western Hill in the gated community. It's a wonderful home. She's a follower. Ask if I could use her upper room for Passover with my disciples. And if so, tell her to leave a man with a pitcher of water. What's going on here? Number one, man with a pitcher of water is a really genius signal because normally women or children carry water. It's not a norm, but it's not, how we say, it's not a two-headed chicken. You know what I'm saying? People aren't going to stop and stare, but it's not going to, it's a perfect signal. What's Jesus doing? He's keeping the place secret from Judas. Because if Judas had known the place, he'd have had the soldiers there, and there'd be no upper room, there'd be no Gethsemane. So Jesus very cleverly, wise as a serpent, harmless as a dove, keeps it secret. Now he takes his disciples and he leads them. Sometime sends Peter and John, and they would have gone to the temple with the lamb that they've had already for some days. They had bought a lamb as a group. They're going to, and now you take it to the temple. The lamb is sacrificed, and I'd love to talk about it, but as many as, listen, Josephus says about 200,000 lambs, but that may be hyperbolic, but certainly tens of thousands of lambs are going to be, and they have to be sacrificed between, it says in the Bible, at twilight, but actually what the Hebrew says is between the evenings. And in Jewish culture, especially in Jerusalem, you live for the afternoon. In the hot sun, you know, it's hot and the air rises, and mid-afternoon you get these refreshing Mediterranean breezes. You live for that. And that's the first evening, and then when the sun disappears, that's the second evening. So about 3 to 7:30, and you got all those lambs, and they had a Henry Ford eat your heart out assembly line going on. Let me just tell you, honest to goodness, each lamb took less than a minute, and it's quite a story. But at any rate, so Peter and John go attend to that. They butcher the lamb, they roast the lamb, they take it and prepare it in the place where Jesus has directed them. Now Jesus takes the disciples. And all along, Judas has got to be thinking, remember now, Judas has got 600 soldiers, 70 Sanhedrinists, and Pilate's entire judicial apparatus waiting to try Jesus in the middle of the night. Folks, get this. The whole plot is to get Jesus arrested, sentenced, executed, and on his way to the cross before the city wakes up. Because Jewish and Roman, his enemies, both Jewish and Roman, have Sunday, Monday, Tuesday ringing in their ears. So they fully anticipate legitimately that now we understand the dynamic of Tuesday and the choice, but nonetheless. So at any rate, the point is that Judas has got to be thinking, man, I got to get out of here for heaven's sake. So now we come to the upper room, the Passover feast. Afterwards, Jesus, the betrayer, is at the table. They all say, is it I? Judas is sitting next to Jesus, reclining, okay? And Matthew says he said to Jesus, is it I? And Jesus said, it certainly is. So any pretense of subterfuge, it's all gone now. Judas knows that Jesus, but he's angry. Sin makes you stupid. And so what happens is that Judas makes an excuse. He goes off to fetch the Sanhedrinists. Jesus begins to teach, John 14. Oh, I'd love to walk you through this. And but then John 14:31, because he knows that Judas he can calculate how long it's going to take. Here's a map of the city, and here is where Jesus keeps the Last Supper. Here is where the soldiers are. So Judas is going to have to leave here, and this little map has it, and go up here. It's going to take him 20 minutes if he hurries. And get the sand. I know where he is. So he leads the soldiers and the Sanhedrinists with him. But where would he have gone? He went back to the upper room, because that's where he left Jesus. Now he goes storming up that outside staircase into that beautiful upper. There's nobody there. And John is so helpful here. It's one of these places where John really comes to our aid, because Judas is going to follow him out there. And we might think, well, how did Judas know where to find him? And the fact is, John says, and Judas, who betrayed him, knew the place, for Jesus often met there with his disciples, stayed there. And you go to Gethsemane and today, and there is the garden. I think it is probably very legitimate, the garden. But what most people don't know is if you go down the hillside and kind of around a little bit, on the bottom of the hill is a cave. And that cave has a first century olive press in it. The word Gethsemane means olive press. And it's the cave that gives us the confidence that this is, in fact, the place where Jesus. So he brings his disciples, and they may have bedrolls there. You know what I'm saying? They stay there often at night. And so it was a handy place. Evidently, somebody who owned this was well secured, but they allowed Jesus to use it and so on. So now Jesus brings them there, and then he leaves 8 of them there, and he's preaching all the way. So sometimes we call John 14, 15, 16 the upper room discourse. John 14, yes, but then it says in John 14:31, arise, let us go. So Jesus leaves, and he takes his disciples down, back down the hill, and here is Gethsemane. So he takes the disciples from here, and here's that southern gate. He had to go out that gate, the dung gate, and all the way up to Kidron. Meanwhile, Judas comes back to the upper room, discovers that it's empty, and thinks, well, yeah, I got a bunch of soldiers who want to arrest somebody here tonight, so I better come up with something. So I know the city is crowded beyond what you can imagine. There's only one place he could have gone. We've stayed there often. So he leads them by the same route. All right? So 2 points to make. Number 1, Jesus does, in fact, spend that season in prayer. Folks, I should spend more time with it, but let me just say this to you. I think you can't really begin to appreciate, as God intends, what's happening at the cross unless you start with Gethsemane. And I say that for this reason, that I think every artist of every venue of every age can depict physical suffering. How do you depict emotional, bottomless angst? That makes sense to you? Now, I think it's very instructive. I'd love to take you here, but in John 12, verse 22, on Tuesday, the Passion Week, Jesus had been tempted to pray. Remember, he stopped, and his heart was heavy, and he looked at the heavens. This is John 12, Tuesday, and he said, what shall I say? Father, deliver me from this hour? No, it was for this cause that I came onto this hour. And so I'm just going to pray, and would to God he would give us the grace to pray this in the middle of our exigencies, because this is the most noble prayer you can imagine. I'm not going to pray deliver me. I'm just going to say, you be glorified. As awful as it is, all I ask, you be glorified. And this is real. This is father and son. This is family. I'm telling you. Listen, we believe in a triune God. There are 3 persons. They are persons. They enjoy hanging out together. They plan things together. They love one another. Whatever depth of love and devotion, appreciation you have for anybody in your life, it's just a copy, because we're made in the image of God, just a slim copy of the relationship. And so now, as the son in that heavy heart on Tuesday afternoon prays, no, I can't pray that, just be glorified. The Father breaks protocol and speaks aloud and says, I have glorified myself, and I will do it again. That's the promise Jesus took to the cross. That's where his heart was. But is it not instructive that what Jesus refused the temptation, and it's real. If you're struggling over Jesus' temptation, knock it off, read Hebrews. But the fact is that it was real temptation. I'd love to talk to you about impeccability, but it was real. And the point is, what he refused to pray on Tuesday, he prays 3 times. He sweats great drops of blood. There are only 2 times where the Father in heaven dispatched angels to care for Jesus. One was by reason of a 40-day fast. The other was by reason of Jesus struggling with what he was about to endure on your behalf. It's staggering. And let me say this. I'll say it tomorrow morning as well. But what's at stake here? When we think of Jesus dying on a cross, well, how can God die? Listen, don't think of death as the cessation of existence. Death is alienation. Genesis 3, don't eat that tree. On the day you do, you'll die. And so he eats it 963 years or whatever later. No, he died. Adam and Eve knew what it was to fellowship perfectly with God. Now they're alienated. And now listen, I cherish the doctrine of the Trinity almost above all things because it teaches us that we serve a God who loves, whose nature it is to exist in relationship eternally. And whatever that bottomless, unimaginable, infinite love and regard that is that these persons of the Trinity feel for one another, whatever that relationship is, that infinitely blessed relationship, what's going to happen on the cross is that the Father is going to, I like to say, judicially disfellowship the Son. And it's not, hasn't to do with their existence, doesn't have to do with the integrity of the Trinity, anything like that. It has to do with relationship. And by reason of the fact that it is an infinitely blessed relationship, it can accomplish infinite results. That makes sense to you? That's what's at stake. And Jesus, as he contemplates it there in the garden, I tell people, and because it's so clear in the Bible, some people get offended at it. Shame on you. But the fact is that as the cross drew nearer and nearer, it absolutely terrified your Savior. And it wasn't the physical suffering of the cross. That's fine. It was the prospect of being made sin for you and me, and therefore being disfellowship. And I'll tell you something else. Don't you suppose that was just as hard on the Father as it was on the Son, for heaven's sakes? So I think we will explore for eternity the dynamics of the cross. But let me say that as close as we can get to how awful it was is Gethsemane. And the fact that, I like to say, not only did it terrorize Jesus, but it cripplingly terrorized Jesus. I don't know what those angels did. I wonder if they didn't just pick him up off the earth, and it was with angelic support that he staggered out of the garden and awoke his disciples and so on. And 3 times he prayed, if it be any way, let this cup pass. And now, as he leaves the garden, Peter, with the silly, we'll talk about it just a bit after the break, but, lops off the servant's ear and so on. And Jesus says, shall I not drink the cup my Father has given me? We could live 1,000 lives. We'll never know the measure of temptation that Jesus knew to turn back from the cross. And yet, he was anxious for the joy that was set before him. I think that has to do with his relationship to the Father. I think you can put your name in that verse. Endured the cross. I can't walk by Gethsemane. It just gets a hold of me every time I think about it. So I'm giving it short shrift tonight, but suffice it to say that I think it's so helpful to measure the Gethsemane experience against the John 12 experience, with just 2 days earlier. It is significant that what he refused to pray on Tuesday, he prayed 3 times on Thursday. Always, not my will, but thine be done. Amen and amen. All right, let's take that's Thursday night. Now, as he emerges from the garden, let me just say this. As he emerges from the garden with the 12, it's got to be midnight or a little after. Just imagine, you're one of his disciples. Listen, he's been talking for months about dying, and you don't want to hear about it. But last Sunday, he rode into town the whole welcome, and you're saying to yourself, I don't know what this dying talk is, but we are on a roll here. This is a good thing. And then it gets better on Monday and Tuesday. So you are on some sort of spiritual, emotional high, and now you've been in the upper room, and Jesus is talking about dying. You don't want to hear this, and so on. And now you kept falling asleep, but he begged you to pray. And now you come out, and you're standing there in the Valley of Kidron. You look to the south, and here comes, what's going on down there? Wow, there's a whole cohort of soldiers, John says, with armor and lanterns and weapons. And so here they come with torches, all in military form. You got to understand something. The Romans studied Jewish seditions. It happened all the time, and these soldiers had probably never experienced one, but they knew that what the Jews were really good at was guerrilla warfare. So there were always these ambushes and these fake, and so you've got a whole cohort of soldiers, and they are on high alert. They have simply been told, because this is what the Sanhedrinists talked the pilot into, they have been told there is a sedition afoot, and you need to go put it down. They're on high alert. They are ready to spring, and what happens is, I love this, they come, and the Sanhedrinists are out front. And so when the soldiers get close, Jesus steps forward and says, by the way, he had prayed in John 17 on that high priestly prayer that God would protect these 11 disciples. I've done my best. You need to protect them, because Jesus knows this is a horribly dangerous situation. So he steps forward and he says, who is it you're looking for? And I pictured a guy, Jesus of Nazareth. I am he. I'm the one. Leave them alone. Jesus takes steps to protect his own. And I think this is the way it happens. Now, you got to put all four Gospels together, and I've done it with a little imagination, but I think this is what happens. That meanwhile, the Sanhedrinists, the officials and so on, are mingling with the disciples, and Peter takes out his little dagger. He probably had a dagger he had brought from home, because every family had a little ceremonial dagger you'd use to slay the Passover lamb and so on. And he lops off the ear of the high priest. And I picture Jesus saying, I am he. Leave them alone. Then there's a little skirmish. And, excuse me. Puts it back in. Now, honest to goodness, that seems to be what happened. And of course Jesus says, put your sword away, don't you know? But my point is then, a second time he says, as a matter of fact, okay, I've got to quit this. But let me tell you something, folks. When you are reading historical narrative in the Bible, celebrate the mundane. Don't try and find some spiritual thing and everything. Remember when Peter refused to have Jesus wash his feet in John 13? And Jesus said to him, this is in the upper room, said, what I'm doing you don't understand now, but you will hereafter. And everybody says, well, you go to the book of Acts, and Peter finally came to the place where he really understood servant leadership. So Jesus, okay, maybe so. I don't think so. I think Jesus is saying, Peter, I'm trying to make a point here. Will you play along? I'll explain it in a minute. I think that's all that's going on there. And again and again. So when it says that Jesus stepped forward and said, I am he, and they all stumble over themselves, and some people think there was some burst of the Shekinah glory or something like this, or that when he said, I am he, that he was taking the name Yahweh, and these Roman soldiers who didn't even speak the language were so stunned that he would take that name for himself. I think all that's stepping is kind of the Keystone Cops making an arrest, you know what I'm saying? Because they're all heavy, high alert, and he says, I'm he. And, ooh, ooh. So they're in tight formation. I think they stumble over each other and so on. But the fact is, Jesus is arrested, and the 11 escape. They desert him. Now, Peter's going to follow, and John's going to follow, and they're going to wind up Peter is at any rate, some dispute about John, in the courtyard of the high priest, and that remarkable story, but we'll do that. So, Thursday, how's this for? Thursday is a day of messianic preparation. In the upper room, preparing his disciples, and then in the Garden of Gethsemane, preparing his own soul spirit. He was dependent upon prayer. And now he is arrested, and in the morning, in the middle of the night, you have a time of messianic prosecution, and I really want to talk to you about that. So let's take a brief break, okay? Don't be too long. I'll tell you what. How long do we need? Say, quarter till. I'm going to start teaching. You get back in here when you wish, but I'm just going to start teaching at quarter till. We still got a lot of ground to cover. Uh, you have this outline. I have an old PowerPoint here. I should get a newer one. But where I give you the outline, see if I'm right about this. Oh, it came out this way. All right. All right. For what the only thing at stake here is the alliterated outline, which is clearly apostolic methodology. But now I have another P word, and that is prosecution. So I've always done Friday as a day of messianic perfection. We're going to talk about that tomorrow. That's the cross. But I want to back up and talk about late Thursday and early Friday as a time of messianic prosecution, because Jesus is, in fact, going to be tried. Now, I want to point you to something, and I'm not going to spend any time. I keep saying that and then betraying it. But page 21, listen. I'll say this very quickly, and I don't know, and this is an intramural fraternal issue. But there are those who insist that Jesus died on Thursday, as, for instance, one Pastor Stephen Davey, and builds a very strong case for it and so on. I understand. I've studied it. I understand the plural Sabbath. I understand but let me just say this. Number one, honestly, this is high ground here, but the Bible is quite explicit that he died on Friday. Every indication is that he died on Friday. All Christians have always believed that he died on Friday. There's one problem, and what's that one problem? 3 days and 3 nights. It's a legitimate problem. And one way to solve that, though it doesn't solve it very thoroughly, is to say he died on Thursday. So at least he was in the grave for part of 3 nights and 3 days. How am I going to deal with it? Well, number one, know this. There's only one time, and once is enough, in Matthew 12, verse 40, where Jesus says, as Jonah was in the belly of the whale for 3 days and 3 nights, so I'll be in the heart of the earth. There are somewhere over 40 times where Jesus says he was going to rise on the third day. All right, so what we know for sure is those two are synonymous, and we have biblical evidence that they're synonymous. But how can they be synonymous? Seems like if he's going to be in the grave 3 days and 3 nights, he's going to rise on either the fourth day or the fifth day. Well, here's the thing, and I give it to you on the chart. I give you a chart where I try and honestly deal with the various claims, but on page 22 on the back of the chart, it's kind of small print, but it says there is a quote from, it's under letter D, and there is a rabbi who is quoted in the Talmud. He's a first century rabbi. He's quoted 150 years later, but he is explaining Jonah, and he is explaining what the Jewish mind thinks of when it says 3 days and 3 nights. So he's not talking about Jesus, he's talking about Jonah. But he says, and I give you the quote there, that a day and night are an ona. Is a portion, they go together. And then he says, any portion of an ona is as the whole of it. Now, all throughout the Bible, this is the way they figured time. This is when, the regnal data where it tells you that this king reigned for 4 years. Let's say this king reigned for 3 years. I'm making this up. If by our calendar he became king on December 1st, lived a year, and died on January 5th, he was king for 3 years. That's always the way it is. Any part of a year is counted as a year. So that's their habit of mind, and 3 days and 3 nights. Jesus dies on Friday afternoon, is placed in a tomb. That's Friday, that's a day-night. Okay, that's an ona. All of Saturday, Sunday morning comes out of the tomb. Now, here's my point is simply this. I just want to put anybody's mind to rest. It's not as if I haven't thought about it. The fact is that every indication. I'll tell you one indication that's never mentioned, and that is this. Remember we said that when a man dies, you could attend to his body for 3 days, counting the day he died. Well, if Jesus died on Thursday, that's day one. Day two is Saturday. You see, what are those women going to do on Sunday morning? See the point? To finish dressing the body. It would have been sealed if he died on Thursday. But he dies on Friday. So I'm just going to leave that alone. I know it's a perennial issue. Now, let me take you, and in the notes, we can go to Friday. Well, got to find it myself. Thursday, yeah, page 15. And I'll make reference. I'm just going to walk you through it. Let me tell you where I'm headed. And I kind of deliberately arranged. You're saying there was some arrangement to that schedule? Well, kind of. But I've been working to be able to get to Pilate because I am the president, CEO, financial secretary, founder of the Pontius Pilate fan club. He's one of my greatest heroes. I'm not kidding. And yet he's universally regarded as a scoundrel and as a primary villain in the story of Jesus. He's not. And if it were just a matter of protecting Pilate's reputation, who cares, for heaven's sakes? But by reason of Pilate's character, by reason of the role he played in the trial of Jesus, there was established I'll have to get to it, but it is so important in protecting Jesus' reputation. It's stunning the way God used this man, Pilate. But let's not get to him. So Jesus is arrested on Thursday night late. The Sanhedrin has arranged to meet. Now, when Judas went to Sanhedrin, that is Caiaphas' personal villa down on the hill of evil counsel. There is on the western hill, high on the western hill, very, very close to the place where Jesus kept the Passover, and very close to where he's going to be tried by Pilate, there is a priestly villa. And it is the most beautiful villa in the city of Jerusalem, short of Herod's palace itself. And it is, whoever is the high priest gets to live there. Well, Annas, to whom Jesus is going to be brought first in John chapter 18, Annas was the high priest, and then that was in 6 A.D. I think it was 6. But at any rate, he got 2 of his sons-in-law, and one of his sons, I think I was. So that house has been ruling the high priestly office. Because remember, it's bribing Rome, and so they've been living this. So Jesus is taken now to the priestly home of Caiaphas. And you're going to have, this is where the Sanhedrin is gathered. And you're going to have it's not a trial formally, because they're not gathering to adjudicate Jesus' innocence or guilt. They're gathering, here's their problem. And it is entirely a function of Jesus' cleverness. They can't get anybody who will say, I heard him say he was Messiah King, because he has been so careful not to use that terminology. And so you're going to have, now let me say 2 things real quickly. Number one, there are going to be really 6 steps in the judicial proceedings. 3 Jewish, Sanhedrin, 3 Roman. Pilate, Herod Antipas, Pilate. We are told again and again that the record of the trials is totally, you can't reconcile them, that's totally confused, it's mishmash, and the reason is because no one gospel tells all the stories. So with regard to the Jewish trial, I say trials, hearings, it's really kind of a grand jury. They've got an appointment with Pilate at 4:30 in the morning, and I'll tell you how I get there. They got an appointment to bring him to be literally legally tried, but they have to have an indictment. They have to have a credible case that he is a messianic claimant. That's the point, that he is that he's a pretender king. And they can't get anybody who can give that testimony. So what happens is they bring Jesus, first of all, to those Jewish hearings, and when they get to that huge villa, aged Annas wants to interview him. And only John tells that story, John 18. And he tells how, and he says he brought to Annas first. He knows he's got the synoptics, and the synoptics say they take him to Caiaphas. And Caiaphas is the high priest. He rules over the Sanhedrin. But John says they took him first to Annas. And again, Annas is hoping he can come up with something, and so he interrogates him. And I'm just going to tell you this story, John 18. But you remember that Annas says, tell me about your teaching and your doctrine. And Jesus says, I've always taught in the marketplace and the synagogues. Ask those to whom I taught. Ask those who heard me. Now, folks, number one, there are going to be a stunning and a gut-wrenching, and for the Jewish world, an embarrassing number of ways in which in these proceedings the Jewish leaders violate their very sacred and well-defined protocols of jurisprudence. They're going to break so many of their own laws. It's a huge embarrassment. And all of the Jewish apologetic sites make the same thing. Didn't happen this way. It was really Pilate who pursued Jesus, and we tried to talk him out of it and so on. The Jews did and so on. It's an embarrassment. And well, at any rate, one of the protocols which they are going to violate is that you never, ever have a trial in a private home. You always have it in a public place. And they violate that. And you never have a trial between sundown and sunup because, listen, what's the most basic protocol of jurisprudence in the Old Testament and the Mosaic law that God gave, King Yahweh gave? In the mouth of 2 or 3 witnesses shall every matter be established. And that means eyewitnesses. Well, you don't have a trial at night because you can't get eyewitnesses. The place is asleep. You never have a trial between. That's their law. Well, in the middle of the night, they bring Jesus and to a private home. And first of all, they bring him to Annas. And Annas says, tell me about yourself. Now, another very important protocol and the basis upon which we have a Fifth Amendment is you never interrogate the accused. You cannot interrogate the accused. You can beat a confession out of him. So you can't interrogate the confused. So when Jesus stands before Annas and Annas says, tell me about yourself, all he's doing, and I think he's gently, Jesus is remarkably, honorably deferential. Now, this is illegal, what they're doing, but nonetheless, I don't think it's some defiant attitude. He's just saying, you're the high priest. Live up to your own protocols. You don't interrogate. Ask the people in the mouth of 2 or 3 witnesses. Well, when he says that, all right, the Romans did not allow their peoples, and especially the Jewish people, any force of arms. So the soldiers and the police and so on were all Roman soldiers. But they would assign specific soldiers to specific leaders and so Annas evidently had sort of a bodyguard soldier. And when Jesus answered that way, he cuffed him. Now, another protocol of Jewish law, very explicit is, and very noble, you never punish a person until he's convicted. So now Jesus turns to the soldier, if I've done wrong, testify. But if not, why would you strike me? Now, that's all that goes on. But it just demonstrates that Jesus is so very, very much in control of himself in these proceedings. Not puppetry. You know what I'm saying? All right, so now the Sanhedrin is convened. And only John tells that. Now, Matthew and Mark both tell the next section, the next story, and you're familiar with it. And that is when they try and get all these witnesses and nobody can say it. And so finally they suborn false witnesses and so on. And finally, and I'm going to explain in a minute why I give you this time, but they have an appointment at about 4:30 to have Jesus before Pilate. Because again, the whole idea is to get this done while the city sleeps. So now, I think Caiaphas is watching it. He said, well, we're running out of time here, and we can't. So he breaks, again, a very sacred protocol, and he puts Jesus under oath. So now he drags Jesus out by now and tell us plainly, "Are you the Christ, the Son of the living God?" And Jesus replies, "Absolutely." Now, what he says in Mark is, "Ego eimi." It's interesting that this is probably happening in Aramaic. And Aramaic, interestingly, take notes because I'm about to tell you everything I know about Aramaic. But Aramaic has no single word for yes. But there are all sorts of very different expressions. And the strongest of them, my dad used it. He didn't know any Aramaic, but it's hot today. You said it. Remember that? You ever hear somebody say, "You said it"? That's the strongest way. And so in Matthew, he records that when he said, "Art you the Christ, Son of God?" his answer was, "Thou sayest." You said it. It's Aramaic. It's the strongest way. Some people say, well, that's contradictory to what he said over Mark. It's exactly the same. The way you take Aramaic, "you said it," and you put it in Greek is ego eimi. Exactly. Well, now, get in the moment. Because here these Sanhedrinists, they're frustrated. They've actually pulled this off. They've arrested him in the absence of the multitude. They've been so angry for so long. Now they haul him in and they can't find anybody. And finally Jesus says right out loud, "I am." And they think, we got him. We got him. Now we can take him to Pilate. We all heard him claim. Listen, let me ask you two questions. Number one, of those two claims, I told you before that Jesus' claims are to be the Messiah, God come in the flesh. Which is the most fundamentally offensive to the Jewish mind? Messiah or God come in the flesh? Clearly, it's God come in the flesh. But at this moment in time, which is the most important to Caiaphas? See, all he wants to hear him say is, "I am Messiah." That's king. We got him. Now, the problem is that because it's in the middle of the night, and because Pilate's not at all happy about this, he knows it was for envy. So he's playing along. He's got this issue. I mean, he's got the hottest potato in human history. If this thing could blow any time, and if it does, why, his head is going to roll. So he's doing his best to play along. But at any rate, the point is that they're going to take him to Pilate, and because it was wrong to do it between sundown and sunup, they contrived to wait until the first blush of dawn. And all three synoptics make this point. Only Luke tells the whole story, but Matthew and Mark refer to it, that at the first, and I'm thinking gray, not pink, okay? So at the first blush of dawn, they're going to haul Jesus. They put him in hold, and this is when some soldiers abuse him and so on, but now they're going to drag him out and put him in front of the Sanhedrin again, and after sunup say, "Are you the Christ?" And that's the story in Luke. He tells the story. And interestingly, this is a little thick, but what they ask him is, "Are you the Christ?" And Jesus says, "I'm not going to answer that." Okay. "Are you the Christ, the Son of the living God?" See, my point is they don't care about the Son of the living God, but Jesus is zealous, determined that the record is going to be exact, that what he claimed was, and what he's going to go to the cross for was claiming to be the Son of Christ, the Son of God. That's John 19:7. But again, so now, why do I say 4:30? Because I've sat up on the roof of the hotel in the spring of the year, and I've read others and so on, and the sun just begins to break through the horizon, just on the horizon, just a little bit of gray light about 4:30. Now, time out. We have some, remember, coherent. It's got to be coherent. And we have some rather tight time constraints because he's only going to be taken to Pilate at the very blush of dawn, and he's going to be turned over to be crucified at 6 a.m. That's explicit in John 19 and verse 14. So we got about an hour and a half to work with on this whole Roman trial. Does that make sense to you? Now, again, various Gospels focus on various elements. I'm going to walk you through it. I'm going to take you to John because there are a couple of really important references in John 18. But at any rate, and here it is. These are the Jewish trials. And now John 18 and verse 28 is where I'm going to take you. So they have an indictment now. They can make the case. Now, let me do a timeout. in the first place. Shame on me. But I was talking to Matt, and folks, and I've encouraged Jason to introduce him to you. There's a dear friend named Joel Kramer, and you ought to get close to him. I mean, you ought to follow him. He has a YouTube channel called Expedition Bible. Oh, I love these. And I could tell you I could tell you Joel Kramer stories all day long. He's the most amazing guy. Matter of fact, our seminary takes people to Israel, and he's a huge part of that. And we also take people to Jordan, our students to Jordan. And he's entirely the father of that. And we were scoping that out one time. It's just 4 of us in a little 4x, just a little SUV. And we're bouncing around Jordan. And he's the greatest storyteller that ever lived. And he's telling some story, and he laughs, and he says, this is what he said. He said, yeah, that was almost as bad as that time I got caught by the cannibals. Ooh, I want to hear the cannibal story. You can read about it. He wrote a book, Beyond Fear, and he did. He made up his mind. He wanted to put himself in a place where he had to depend upon God, and so he determined to hike 1,100 miles from northern New Guinea to the southern shore, and along the ways and I'll tell you one other thing, as long as I brought it up. When he started out, he went to the new tribes people, and they said, there are tribes up there we've never been able to contact. Well, he contacted them. He said, he was hacking his way. He had some local guides, and all of a sudden those local guides screamed and went running off, and out of the woods come these, full-on. They take him and hold him for 4 or 5 days, and, him and his friend. And for some reason, the sweet providence of God, one of the tribesmen talked the others into letting them go. So I let them go. And when they got done, it was a horrific experience. But when they got, the whole hike. But they went to the new tribes and told them about it today. That whole tribe is Christian. It's a very strong Christian tribe because of that. But anyway, Joel Kramer. And he, for 10 years, was a student in Jerusalem. And the number one administrator, assistant to a very important archaeologist named Shimon Gibson. And he, wait a minute. There, that's what I want. That's I don't know, you can see that picture at all. Yeah. But without getting into it, because I can get lost in this is exciting. That is the spot where Jesus was tried by Pontius Pilate. It's a long story. It's a gate system. I can take you there. It's one of the highlights. I love people taking it, and I'll drive you nuts telling you the story. But it is an amazing place. See, someday they're going to build big church over that. And you're going to have to pay, and you won't be able to see it. But for now, nobody knows it's there, and it's wide open, and it's delightful. But anyway, I'm going to try I want you to picture this, because what there is, and up on the top left you have the remains, and in the bottom right, you can't see it very well, is the reconstruction. But let's imagine this. Here we are. We are on the Valley of Hinnom. We're on the Valley of Hinnom, long, beautiful grass hill. And here is a gate, which is a gate system, which has a courtyard, which has a judgment seat, a bema seat. So I'm going to say that over there beyond the right side there in a palm tree, there is these gates all have an inner gate and an outer gate. In other words, it's a gate system, so you have an outer gate, courtyard, and an inner gate. The inner gate's over there, and the outer gate is these steps right here. So, and then there's a wall. It's a courtyard, and over there on the left side, there is, and there are remains of it in the modern Turkish wall. There is a stair step that goes up to a bema seat. All right? Are you with me? So we got the gate system, and so now to put it together, the priestly villa of Caiaphas is literally a 3-minute walk away, because this crowded western hill is where the wealthy want to live, because you catch the breezes. So here you have Herod's marvelous, marvelous palace. This is a gate into Herod's palace. Herod's a dead guy, okay? But he built himself a beautiful, beautiful palace on the western side of the city. And Josephus says next to the temple itself, this was his greatest, most beautiful accomplishment. And now he's a dead guy, and Pilate is the prefect, the Roman officer, and Pilate actually lives down in Caesarea Maritima at another beautiful summer palace that Herod had built. Herod lived up here and went down there for the summer. The prefects lived down there and came up here. So Pilate's in town for the feast. He's in and what happened is that when Herod built that palace, he didn't include a gate that let him directly out of the city. He had to go through the city to get out. And one time he had been visiting the grave of his dear departed wife, whom he murdered, and he came back, and they wouldn't let him in town because he was unclean. And he got into town. That's enough of that. So he built himself. Josephus is explicit about this. He built himself this gate on the western side of the city, and so now here's what happens. Here come the Sanhedrinists, and they got him. Jesus has openly confessed. So now they figure this is going to be easy. And again, this had all been arranged, and I'm sure Pilate's agents had met with the Sanhedrins, and some drachma had changed hands and so on, because this is all about getting Jesus on his way to the cross before the city wakes up. So no matter how excited you were on Sunday, Monday, and Tuesday, the Romans have taken over. They're crucifying him. Not my job. The Sanhedrinists would say, all right, so now they come in this outer gate, and I picture them. They come in this outer gate with Jesus, and by now he's been misused and so on. And they stand here, and Pilate comes out. He comes out, and he doesn't, it's 4:30 in the morning. But this is a judicial proceeding. And so he comes out with he's not coming out always saying his bathrobe and bunny slippers. You know what I'm saying? He's going to come out in his judicial, and he's got his guards and so on. And he marches up, he walks up, and he's sitting up there on that bema seat. Here stand the Sanhedrinists and Jesus, and he says, this is John 18, what is the charge? And they say, if he weren't a malefactor, we wouldn't have brought him to you. Now, I think what they're saying is, we've gone over this. You just play your role, for heaven's sakes. We don't need this. And Pilate, it just displays a character that is remarkable, a nobility of character that is remarkable by any standard. And he says, I'm not going to do that. You go crucify him. You go judge him yourself. And the Jewish leaders say, you know that we don't have a power to put a person to death. So you can tell this is not a real trial. This is a monkey trial to get. And so now I want to read to you John 18. It says that, so you have this, and then, so after they said, it's not lawful for us to put anyone to death, Pilate entered the praetorium again, and he called Jesus. Now, the praetorium, it actually means the domicile of the senior officer. It actually comes from the battlefield. So on the battlefield, the Romans are all just spread out, and here's a huge, well-fortified tent, and that's where the senior officer, that's the praetorium. Well, Pilate normally lives down there, but when he comes to town, this is the praetorium. Time out. I know that a lot of people in the past, not today, have put this at the Fortress Antonia. It didn't happen there. It happened here. Be done with it. So I can talk to you about it. But, because you're seeing a lot of books, and that map I showed you, he has the trial happening at the Fortress Antonia. Okay, we took care of that logically, didn't we? But the point is that, that's hard to see. So Jesus, Pilate, listen, I'll tell you something, and this is part of what animates me here. I'm going to make this bigger. I got it all colored, so it's still hard, but all right. In 1 Timothy 6, as he's closing that epistle, Paul says to Timothy, I adjure thee by the living God, this is verse 13, I adjure thee by the living God and by the good confession that Jesus made before Pontius Pilate. And some years ago, I don't know, I was reading it like you read everything else, you read it how many times, and it just struck me, and I thought, well, no, wait a minute. There was something about the way Jesus carried himself before Pilate that so impressed itself on the early Christian community that Paul could just refer to it offhandedly. Here is this, and I think what he is saying is, you're going to face persecution Behave like Jesus did. I adjure thee by that good confession. Well, now here's before Pontius Pilate, and here's another curious reality that I discovered when I went after it, is that in all of the trial, and there's one little, question here, but in all of Jesus' trial before Pontius Pilate, he never, ever spoke, except 2 times when he was alone inside the praetorium with Jesus. This has got to be the good confession. And I think we need to go to school on the way Jesus handled himself. And it is stunning. So, John 18, he takes him inside the praetorium. He entered the praetorium again, called Jesus, and said to him, now, I want to walk you through this. That's so important. He says, are you the king of the Jews? Now, again, get in the moment. Jesus is on trial. He's been accused by the Sanhedrin of being a seditionist, a pretender king. And Pilate says, are you the king of the Jews? Now, the problem with that is it is cripplingly ambiguous. He might be asking, are you a pretender king? Or he might be asking, are you the long-awaited king of the Jews? And Jesus, by reason of the fact that he is zealous for the truth, and by reason of the fact that at this moment, the Spirit of God did not direct him to omnisciently know, he has to ask a question. And he does. He says, are you speaking for yourself about this, or did others tell you this concerning me? What he is saying is, are you asking from your heart whether I'm the king of the Jews, or are you asking me if I'm guilty of what others have said? And Pilate responds by saying, and listen, please, I'm physically, somehow, wipe from your mind, disabuse from your mind, take a moment to do it, and remove this idea that Pilate was just a rogue and a cynic, and am I a Jew? Pilate, he's got the most serious dilemma that man ever faced. Is he going to crucify this Nazarene? And Pilate doesn't live in a cave. Don't you suppose that Pilate, his wife, has been much impacted by it? I'm persuaded, because of what goes on right here, that Pilate was very much a seeker. He was but now he's had to put on his judicial robes and play the role of a judge, and he does it well. He does it honorably. There is nothing, you might say, well, he's interrogating the witness. It was a Jewish protocol that you didn't interrogate the witness. Not Roman. Now, if he was a citizen, he couldn't interrogate. But everything Pilate does, he's playing by the book. And that's his obligation. He's a Roman officer. His primary duty is to protect Rome. And the whole Jewish world is insisting that this man is a seditionist. And so Pilate says, am I a Jew? What he means is, do you realize what the Jewish people are saying? And he says, your own nation and the chief priests have delivered you to me. What have you done? Now, folks, there's one question on the table. Are you a seditionist? Jesus' reply, I love Jesus' reply. But without getting into this, if it don't make sense, don't worry about it. But verse 36, which is so noble, so important, so genius, but is so misused. I was just reading an article just this morning, and yesterday afternoon, and took this verse. So if you've got, and Lord bless you, but if you've got an amillennialist friend, and he accidentally drops his Bible, it's flopping open to this verse. You know what I'm saying? This is where he lives. This is his great. So the idea is, amillennialist means that Jesus didn't come to offer the kingdom, but to redefine the kingdom, and the kingdom is here today, and Jesus is reigning, and the earth is covered with the knowledge of the Lord, like the water covers the sea today. Is that true in Tomball? Not true where I come from. Anyway, I got a thing. I'll admit to it. I don't know if it's entirely sanctified, but I'll stop whatever I'm doing and go across the street to beat up on the Am Hill. There's no doubt about that. But the point is, okay, Jesus, this is so legitimate, what Pilate is doing. And so Jesus, he's asked by the rightfully authorized judge, are you a seditionist? Are you? And Jesus seizes the opportunity to deliver himself, I like to say, of a one-sentence lecture on kingdom theology that totally unsays everything the Old Testament ever said. Alone with Pilate in the praetorium. You think so? Probably not. Jesus' answer is genius. And he says, my kingdom is, the question is, are you a sedition? My kingdom is not of this world. What did he mean by this world? That's hard to know. No, it's not. Read the next verse. If my kingdom were of, not the next verse, the next sentence. If my kingdom were of this world, then would my servants fight that I wouldn't be delivered. Now, and then he says, my kingdom does not come in this way, does not come from here, from that sort of sedition. Now, listen, honest to goodness, I think Pilate maybe stood there and thought about it, and like I say, he didn't live in a cave, and he knew that Jesus for 3 years had been going up and down the countryside, and hundreds of thousands of people had bowed the knee and following him, and not one of them had ever made any sort of trouble for the Roman Empire. They were probably the best citizens he had. And here's the curious thing. After this exchange, I'm not done, but Pilate's going to bring Jesus out from that inner gate. He's going to go up to his bema seat, and of course, Jesus is standing here with the accusers, and they're going, okay, the sun's going to come up. Let's get on with it. And Pilate's going to say, I find no fault in him. Oh, man. The people, they would have gone nuts, and they do. But let me just back up. My point is this. Again and again, Pilate, the duly constituted, fully authorized judge, the only man on earth with either the authority or the opportunity to judge Jesus as to the charge that he was a sedition. He's going to say again and again, the man is guiltless. I will not crucify him. It's stunning. Here's my question. It's an honest question. How came Pilate to that persuasion? There's only one answer. That sentence right there. This is an airtight, legal, historical argument for his innocence. And it worked. My kingdom, you know very well, every Jewish sedition looks the same. Some false Messiah finds himself some sort of a fortification of the Jeshimon. He gathers a little militia, and they go out and they fall upon the Roman troops and armories and so on. And he says, if my kingdom is not of this world, if it were, this is why Peter had to put that sword away the night before, so he could make this statement, this argument. But are you with me? What I'm saying is that Jesus, this is absolute genius. He just demonstrates that historically, sedition is not an abstract idea. There are evidences of sedition. It doesn't, my servants don't fight. And Pilate comes away, and I'm telling you, at the expense of putting himself and his career at horrible risk, he's going to defy the Jewish leadership. I'm not going to crucify him. Now he's ultimately going to do it. We're going to talk about it. The point to be, then notice what goes on. This is why I say I think Jesus is a seeker, because then Pilate alone inside the praetorium, just him and Jesus, he says to him, are you a king then? He's asking whether or not he is the Messiah. That's why I say, and this has nothing to do with the legal proceedings. I think Pilate, out of honesty, says, are you a king? Folks, like I say, I am a fire-breathing premillennialist. You know what you mean when you say that? Just that there's going to be a literal kingdom, just the Bible says. That's the millennial part. And the pre-part is, it only happens when Jesus makes it happen. He's got to come and make it happen. That's all you're saying. And I'm a son of the kingdom. I am so hungry for the kingdom. I always say, we think, and it's not inappropriate, we think of heaven, and that's. I'm closer than you are, for heaven's sakes. But the fact is that, so I die, I walk on streets of gold, amen. This world still lies in the lap of the evil one, and everything that is sacred and holy and noble is defiled, and that which is wicked and fallen is celebrated. Don't you hunger for that to be put right? That's the kingdom. We're headed for the kingdom. I love, and for Jesus, Jesus was a premillennialist. He said, I love this. You say rightly that I'm a king. It was for this purpose that I was born. It was for this purpose that I came into the world, that I should declare, and not inappropriately, but I think unfortunately, it says that I should bear witness to the truth. Now, it's a definite article, but every definite article has very deliberate, demonstrative, this, that, and I think it could be better read, this truth, in the context. I'm here not just to declare to whatever nebulous idea of the truth, this truth, that I am the king, I am the Messiah, and I am going to reign over a kingdom. And then he goes on to say, hear this, I got to be quick, everyone who is of the truth hears my voice. All right, they're alone inside. This is the first of two times. Real quickly, Pilate said to him, what is truth? Again, that is always racked up to sin. What is truth? I don't think so at all. I think he's saying, do you realize where I am here? I got to make a decision. I got to know what is truth. And I think he's closer to it than he was. All right, quickly. I already said, brings him out. The Sanhedrin is eager. I don't find any fault in this man. And they begin to say, he's a troublemaker ever since Galilee. And when Pilate heard the word Galilee, he thought, wait a minute, I'm not in charge of Galilee. Herod Antipas is, and Herod Antipas is in town. Now, this becomes important real quickly. This business of the only an hour and a half, and you see even the map that I give you, and you have Jesus being hauled all over the city. You can't get it done in an hour and a half if you do that. But Herod Antipas has a palace in Tiberias and a palace down in the Dead Sea in Machaerus. He's here in town. All right, where is this all happening? This is Herod's palace. Who was Herod Antipas's daddy? It was Herod Antipas. It was Herod. In other words, Herod grew up here. I think he may have had the same posters on the wall. You know what I'm saying? So I think he's right there. Of course, when he comes to town, he's going to stay in this lavish, beautiful palace that he grew up in. So now they just trundle him across, and nothing comes of that. Herod just wants to see a miracle and all that. So that nothing comes of it. While Jesus is off to Herod Antipas, I think Pilate comes up with a really good idea. And let me say, and you can see this as we stand at the site, but the bema seat was so situated that he could see over the defensive wall and see the crowds. And what's happening is the city is waking up. Now, when they brought Jesus to Pilate, the city was asleep. But the sun is rising, they get up early, and can you imagine the wildfire speed with which the story would spread through that city that the one whom we welcomed as king and celebrated on Monday and Tuesday is now on trial for his life on the western side of the city. So the city is waking up, and Pilate, he's a clever guy. And he thinks, all right, there is this policy that we release one prisoner. We've decided on Barabbas, but I'll give them a choice. And I know dead sure that they love Jesus. So as I say, now Pilate says to the masses, whom would you have me give you, Jesus or Barabbas? And to his amazement, he says, what do you want me to do with the Christ, the one you call the Christ? You welcomed him. But they say, give us Barabbas. And the Bible says that the Sanhedrin has talked him into it. Now, let me go one more step. Give me just a couple more minutes. Because what happens is, and this is going to be very, very one thing right after the other, but Pilate works very hard to get Jesus delivered. But no matter what, they insist that he be crucified. He said, I'm going to scourge him. So I think probably Pilate gives up. And he says, all right, let me just say, and I'll talk more about this tomorrow, but the Romans' crucifixion, as applied by the Romans, especially to seditionists, it has to be very cruel. They want it to be cruel and lingering. And to that end, they would often, and this is much overplayed in many of the stories, but before he was crucified, he would be scourged, almost surgically. But the idea is they wanted to open up new, deep wounds, nerve-exposing wounds all across the backside, because when you are crucified, immediately your rib cage settles in on your breathing apparatus, and you can't breathe without pushing up. That's why if you want to kill him, you break his legs. And there was apparati built into the experience where you could push up, and they were careful to preserve the muscles and so on, because you couldn't sleep on the cross, you couldn't slip into a coma, and so the point is that as he pushed himself up on that rough timber, those splinters are going to be driven in. And so the point is, Pilate says, I'll talk more about that tomorrow, but Pilate says, I'm going to scourge him, probably in anticipation of, okay, I give up. They take him inside. Now, in that beautiful palace that Herod had built, he included a kind of a barracks, but it was very, very beautiful for his Praetorian Guard. Herod had a crack unit, and they would stay with him. And so probably in the southern end of the, Josephus says, in the southern end of the palace, it was a fifth of a mile long, his palace was. But in the southern end was a barracks and probably a place of scourging. And so they take Jesus in, and this is when he is scourged in the crown of thorns and a purple robe and so on. And now what happens is that Pilate, I want you to picture, they bring Jesus out, and probably, again, if you don't mind, this is a wall, but there's a gate here. It's those, oh, you don't see it there, but the steps have been uncovered leading up to the gate, and one part of the gate has been uncovered. But the point is that I think Pilate stands here with Jesus, and he looks out over the masses, and he says, "Behold the man." And I think he is saying, have you had enough? You're saying that this man is a threat to Rome. You're saying this is a sedition. Have you had enough? But they continue to cry out, "Crucify him." And let me go back to John. This is John 19. And that's not me, is it? John 19, I got a quote. You know what? Why don't I get rid of this for heaven's sake? It's perfectly powered. John 19, he says, took and scourged him, and so on. Pilate came out and says, "Behold, I am bringing him out to you, that you may know that I find no fault in him." 5 different times he explicitly says the man is innocent. Therefore, when the chief priests and officers saw him, they said, "Crucify him." And Pilate said, "You take him, I find no fault." And then in verse 7, and this is both in terms of the narrative and in terms of the theology, this is a huge verse, because the Sanhedrinists cry out, well, if you won't crucify him as a seditionist, they'd given up on that, he ought to die because he made himself the Son of God. That's why Jesus went to the cross. But when Pilate heard that, he was the more afraid. And so, here it is. When Pilate heard that saying, he was the more afraid, and he went again into the praetorium. This is the second time. And he said to Jesus, "Where are you from?" Now, again, he's not asking if he was born in Bethlehem. I think he was saying, who in the world are you? What's going on here? You're Pilate. Sunday, you're scared to death as the whole city erupts in happy welcome of a king. You don't know what to do with this. Monday and Tuesday. And yet the whole city welcomed and loved him. But now, no matter what he says, they want to crucify him. Where are you from? And Jesus doesn't speak. And Pilate answers, and he says, "Are you not speaking to me? Do you not know that I have power to crucify you and power to release you?" Now, I'm going to say again that a lot of people read that as if he's being hubristic. "You're not speaking to me? Don't you realize who I am? I'm the guy in charge here." I don't think so at all. I think what he is saying is, you won't speak to me? Don't you realize I got a decision to make? I have to make a decision. Help me here. And Jesus does. Jesus responds by saying, now I'm going to read this differently than you're used to reading it, but I take it under advisement. He says, "You would have no power at all against me unless it had been given you from above. Therefore, the one who has delivered me to you, Caiaphas, has the greater sin." Now, you know that that's almost universally in our circles read to mean from above is from God, right? So we read it as if Jesus is saying, kind of patting Pilate on the head. "Oh, don't be taking too much to yourself. You wouldn't even be there, except my Father in heaven arranged it." If that's what he meant, I can't make any sense of the next statement. Therefore, the one who turned me over has the greater sin. That doesn't make any sense to me. Why, if my Father put you here, therefore Caiaphas has the greater sin? Listen, I think you should read it this way. From above means from Roman authorities above you. And all he is saying is that you didn't chase me down. This isn't your fight, Pilate. You're only here. You only have this authority because you were assigned this jurisdiction. Now it makes perfect sense to hear him say, therefore, the one who turned me over to you has the greater sin. That makes sense to you? I think that's what I honestly, I've got a big imagination. I picture Jesus kind of stepping forward, just the two of them, shackled hands, blood, maybe taking Pilate by the shoulders and saying, Pilate, this is not your fight. You're only here because you were assigned this. The real guilt belongs to Caiaphas. If you allow that, just as a thought exercise, then you have to ask the next question, and it's just as tough. What is Jesus saying? I think Jesus is giving Pilate permission to go ahead. Honest to God, you think, this is huge. Jesus has to go to the cross. Pilate has a role to play. By reason of a reserve of character that is rather stunning, he's reluctant to do it. And I think Jesus is saying, he's not excusing him, but he's saying, this is not your fight. The real sinner is Caiaphas. Now, he's going to go back out, Pilate is, and try harder to deliver Jesus. But now, the Sanhedrins are going to play their trump card. And they're going to say, if you don't, now again, I could go into this, and Pilate had used up all his coupons in Rome. Just take it for that. He knew he was on thin ice. And now they say, if you don't crucify him, we're going to tell Tiberius. Now, I think that gets Pilate's attention, but I really think that what's really going on in the back of his mind is Jesus saying, this is not your fight. Now, what's going to happen is Pilate, and this is a little, but I'm being specific about chronology that's not that specific, but I picture Pilate, here's Jesus standing there bloodied. Pilate goes up, takes his seat, maybe calls for one of the soldiers to bring him a basin and a rag, and he sits there and quite ceremoniously washes his hands. And then he comes down off those steps, and I picture him maybe going into the praetorium through that gate, maybe taking that rag and handing it to one of the soldiers, and then looking back over his shoulder and saying, you do with them what you will. Pilate never, ever bends at all about Jesus' innocence. Now, I'm going to make this point tomorrow. Are you with me so far? Here's why this means so much to me. Because it was, all right, I'm going to have to say this again tomorrow. I'll say it quickly. There are 3 times in the Gospel of John where Jesus says, if I am lifted up. As Moses lifted up the serpent in the water, even so must I be lifted up. John chapter 8, when I am lifted up, the Pharisees feast of Tabernacles, and they're saying, you're not speaking for God. He says this, when I am lifted up, then you will know that I'm speaking of the Father. And then John 12, that passage we looked at before, if I am lifted up, will draw men to myself. And after that passage in John 12, John the Apostle gives us this amazing insight. This he spoke concerning the type of death he would die. It was absolutely imperative. And when he was taken to, in John chapter 18, when he was taken by the Sanhedrins to Pilate, and Pilate said, you go, and they said, we can't put a man to death. And then John says this was in fulfillment of what Jesus said concerning the type of death he would die. Now, I'm going to tell you something. I'm going to say this again tomorrow, but the Bible is explicit that it was imperative that Jesus die by being lifted up. Why? Well, I think the answer is this. Again, you're going to hear this tomorrow, but I got to say this to make my point. The Romans demanded that crucifixion of a seditionist be characterized, certainly it had to be cruel, beyond what we can imagine. It had to be lingering. They wanted him on the cross for a couple of days. That's why I remember Pilate was so amazed that Jesus was already dead. And it had to be public, because a crucifixion was not about executing the seditionist. It was about putting down the sedition. This was an object lesson. And for that reason, above all things, crucifixion had to be publicly certified. There had to be, on the cross, physical evidence that the man had died. Why? Because they would not allow the possibility that the rumor would get out somehow he had survived and the sedition could go on. We're trying to put down a sedition. This is the seditionist. He's dead. And that's the blood and water that flow out of his side. So I think the reason it was so imperative, stoning could be botched, right? I mean, honest to goodness, Paul got stoned in Lystra and got up, went into town. We're all saying, what in the world went on? Bad aim? What's going on there? Well, the fact is, this crucifixion could not be botched. There was a protocol that if a man were inadvertently taken down off the cross, seditionist, and laying on the ground the last hint of life, the flutter of an eyelid or something, and then he died, all 4 soldiers assigned to that duty were put on a cross. That's how serious Rome was. You remember the death stench for Lazarus? See, the reality of that miracle is only as dependable as the reality of his death. What about Jesus' resurrection? And I'll tell you something, you didn't have to see it to believe it. You knew all throughout, anywhere in the Roman Empire, you knew dead sure if a man was put on a cross as a seditionist, he was not coming down until he was dead. And so Jesus contrived, if I be lifted up, then you'll know. He contrived to die that horrible death in order that his death might be absolutely historically undeniable. And therefore, when he showed himself alive by many infallible proofs for 40 days, the reality of his resurrection could not be denied. Does that make sense to you? All right, so we're going to suspend it there. What's going to happen is Pilate turns Jesus over to be crucified, and we'll pick that story up in the morning. Okay? Thank you for your patience. We're a little late, so whatever you're going to do this afternoon, you have to do it a little quicker than you planned. All right. Thank you so very much. Yeah.